So welcome everybody, and thank you so much for joining us tonight for this event where we will be discussing many complex issues surrounding glyphosate usage. I'm very, very delighted to be joined by the lovely Patricia Bowerman, who will be acting as my co-host here today. She has been instrumental in helping me set up this event, and I'm really, really grateful to her for her enthusiasm and for her help with arranging it. And you'll get to know more about her specific knowledge in this area later, as she is one of our expert speakers tonight. And just in case you're not aware, glyphosate-based herbicides are used to control a wide variety of weeds that grow among food crops, on residential lawns, in our gardens, in our parks, roadsides, conservation and wildlife areas, forests and waterways, so kind of everywhere, okay? And although it's a weed killer today, most frequently known as Roundup, it was first patented back in 1961. And it was patented then as a chelating agent to strip mineral deposits off pipes and boilers in commercial hot water systems. Yes, that's exactly what it was started out as. And then in 1968, Monsanto patented it for a totally different application as a herbicide for use in agriculture. So as a non-selective herbicide, it kills almost any plant that it came into contact with, and farmers at that stage had to be very, very cautious when using it. And then in the 1980s, Monsanto engineers spliced microbial genes into common crops to make them resistant to Roundup. And then these crops are what's commonly known as genetically modified organisms, or GMOs as we know them today. So in 1996, when these crops came to the market, it transformed the use of glyphosate, and they brought the promise to end world hunger and feed the world, okay? So we'll be discussing how well that's working out. So just to make you aware, in case you didn't see the video that we did previously in July, I think it was, with Patricia, some of the most common crops that are GMOs are soybeans, corn, sugar beets, canola, cotton, and alfalfa. So that gives us a little background on glyphosate. And our panel of experts tonight will each share their perspectives on the impact of glyphosate on human health and the environment. Now, the first of those experts that we're going to have talk to us tonight is Patrick Holford. So Patrick is one of our ambassadors at the People's Health Alliance, and he's a leading spokesman on nutrition and mental health. He's the founder of both the Food for the Brain Foundation, the Vitamin C for COVID, and the Institute for Optimum Nutrition, which is an educational charity that offers degree-accredited training in nutritional therapy. As a nutritional therapist myself, I followed Patrick for many years. And my husband would say that I have far too many of the numerous books that Patrick has written, but I would very much disagree with that. So unfortunately, Patrick couldn't be with us live tonight because he's flying over the Alps. And when he first told us that, I assumed that he meant in a plane. But that's not what he meant at all. As we talked further, it transpired that in typical Patrick Holford style, he's actually paragliding over the Alps this weekend. And he said that as he's 65, he likes to try new things. So he studied meteorology, aeronautical somethings, air law, and all of it. He had to study all of these things so that he could take on this new challenge, which he's doing this weekend. And so I was very much delighted to be able to catch up with Patrick and Catherine McBean, our founder here at the PFFA, earlier this week. And at that point, Patrick was on his farm in Wales, and he told me that they're just introducing alpacas onto that farm. And so he took a few minutes out of his bonding session with the male alpacas to come and talk to us and to give us his thoughts on glyphosate. So,
I mean, the background to all of this is that we have evolved eating wild foods.
So sorry, everybody.
So
you will see him in a minute.
Was organic and obviously herbicide and pesticide free. So when you introduce anything, in the case of glyphosate, it's a herbicide. It blocks an enzyme that
stops a plant being able to grow, then we have to assume guilty until proven innocent. And in the case of glyphosate, it's now registered as a carcinogen. So, you spray your whatever, stinging nettles. There is some residual left in the soil. So if you're then going to grow something, what effect is it having on that? And how does it get into us? And it's not a very biodegradable product. So, there's additional problem. And the big problem with toxins is that they're so prevalent in us. I mean, there isn't a single person where you couldn't test their blood and find 300 man-made chemicals. It's incredibly hard to sort of isolate and say how much of cancer is to do with this, or dementia or anything else. So it's definitely guilty until proven innocent. And I think already glyphosates have been proven guilty. We don't really know about the impact in relation to dementia. In Parkinson's, there's definitely a link with toxin exposure. So you can see in some farming communities a greater incidence. Now, one of the things we're doing at Food for the Brain is that when you do your cognitive function test and then fill in the questionnaire is asking you how much of your food is organic and how long have you been eating organic and so on. So in sort of broad ways, we can now start to look at the associations. Do people who eat, the more organic food a person eats, does that mean the less, risk for dementia, cognitive decline in the future? So at the moment, we don't have solid evidence for that. But, there's a lot of, here down in Forest Barn, where I am right now in Wales, and we're just planting our sort of winter crops on our zero dig project. And the idea there, you may know with zero dig, is that once you've established a rich earth, you don't disturb it. So obviously you plant, but you don't, rotivate and turn around. So the fungal network can really establish, and this fungal network can go for a mile. And what we know is that at the end of roots of plants, you get these mycorrhizal roots from the fungi, which is almost like an extension, and they swap nutrients. So you end up with, and we're actually testing the nutrient density of plants in this way. And things like glyphosates are going to, completely mess that process up. And what we know is that plants actually produce immune boosting compounds when they're grown pesticide-free, herbicide-free organically, because what happens is plants are susceptible to viruses, bacteria, fungi, etc., and they can't run. So the way they protect themselves is they produce compounds called salvestrols, which are really anti-cancer. So one of the things we got down the farm is we got Pendragon apples. It's an ancient apple variety, which is the richest in salvestrols. So from a health perspective, you absolutely do not want to have glyphosates. And you absolutely do want to be eating foods with no pesticides, no herbicides. And although there have been sort of different arguments about, do organic food have more nutrients? And I think the answer is they do. And they have less water. So they're not forced to grow very fast, which means more water. So they have more density. I think we can even improve on organic, in these sort of zero dig type ways in terms of nutrient density. But I've eaten organic wherever I can. And remember, if you've got something like an orange with a big skin and it's sprayed, there's less on the inside. So it's less sort of compulsive to have an organic orange. But if you're eating lettuce, you really, really, really want it to be organic. But I've been, eating organic because I don't want herbicides and pesticides. Because I don't want to have any carcinogen, which could trigger an abnormal cell reaction. So, golden rule is, if it's got carcinogenic properties, don't have it. And that's where we are at with glyphosate. And it's part of a movement to kind of work, if you like, with nature rather than against it, which is a very kind of man-centric view. I'm going to kill all the things I don't like and then force the things I do like to grow. And the whole idea of, of zero dig is you're actually creating the mycorrhizal environment, which is perfect for the plants that you wish to grow. So it's a very synergistic thing. Now we don't, well, at least I don't know fully what the effect of eating glyphosate compounds, because obviously they're not in the plants you grow. You know, they're primarily, you know, used to kill weeds, although there is some use in plants actually. What effect that has on the microbiome, I don't exactly know, but that microbiome is sort of like the parallel of the soil's biome, you know, created by the fungal network. So the idea that it wouldn't have an effect is highly unusual. And an example of this, which I think is kind of interesting, there's an ancient wheat called Khorasan, sold as kamut. And my dear friend who's got 8,000 acres growing organic, Bob Quinn, he's done 26 studies now on ancient wheat, which is full of gluten, versus modern wheat, full of gluten. Really, really good studies. And like in one study with IBS, every single IBS sufferer got better on the ancient wheat, full of gluten, and worse on the modern wheat. So what I really think is happening, like yeast, a lot of people react to yeast, is that our immune system knows plants. You know, it knows this ancient wheat, and it's absolutely fine. But it doesn't know whatever it is about modern wheat is causing it to react in an inflammatory way. And it doesn't know glyphosates. So it's not part of our entire evolution. So from my point of view, it's, you know, guilty until proven innocent. It's not part of our evolution, and it's actually already proven to have carcinogenic properties. So, you know, faced with, you know, we've now crossed the 1 in 3 getting cancer. You know, we're moving towards 1 in 2. You know, there's a whole toxic environment. I mean, for example, we know, you know, in case you don't know, I was very interested in mobile phones, and I thought, and then the study came out that basically showed that left-handed people had left-sided glioblastomas in their brain cancer, which is a really aggressive one, and right-handed had right-sided, which is sort of fairly convincing. In the early days, the evidence wasn't, you know, terribly strong, but now there's evidence that 10 years use of mobile phones significantly increases risk for glioblastoma. And then more recently, it was shown that if you take these glial cells and you expose them to the amount of radiation that you get from a normal phone signal, sure enough, you get DNA fragmentation. So you've got a mechanism, you've got an association. You'll never have a cause in terms of randomized controlled trials. Same with, you know, pesticides and herbicides. You can't really say, right, all you guys who have the same demographic, you know, same age, same smoking, same exercise, half of you are going to eat foods without, and half you're going to eat with. It's just not going to happen. And you'd need, you know, the effect of cancer cells like a 10-year process, as the mobile phone thing shows. So the best thing we can go with is big data. So that's what we're trying to gather through the cognitive function test. We've tested 430,000 people now. They're answering the questionnaire, do I or don't eat organic? How much organic do I eat? How long have I been doing it? And that's about the, you know, the closest we can get. So I would say glyphosates are absolutely not part of the health agenda. They're not essential. And although some farmers, you know, may complain because it appears to make their life harder in the short term, it forces them to look at ways of growing in the long term that actually can, you know, the regenerative farming movement that can actually produce more food. So it's just, it helps the paradigm of shifting towards a natural and sustainable way of growing food.
Thank you. That's really, really interesting. And I know you're pushed for time. So if I could ask you just one final question. We're asking each of our speakers to suggest, and I think I actually know the answer to this already. I think you've answered it, but I want to hear it from you. And we're asking each of our speakers to suggest one thing that each of us can do to make a difference in our homes, our community, the government, etc., regarding reducing glyphosate exposure.
Well, I mean, number one is not use it yourself, because many of us do use Roundup, etc. It's tempting when you got patches, stinging nettles, and all the rest of it. We haven't used any on our farm ever, and so as far as we know, this farm has never ever. I mean, we've had it for 8 years now, but even before that. So, you know, walk your talk, number one, and number two, and I'd kind of like your help as well through the PHA and PFFA, is who do we write to, you know, in our local council, to make a difference on this. So please tell me, because we got 60,000 followers, and if there's one action that can take to make your area glyphosate free, if we all work on our areas, I think that would be fantastic.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And then obviously, as you've spoken so very clearly on, it's try and eat organic as frequently as you can, and thinking about like those dirty dozen and the clean 15 or whatever, where we've got the thicker skins on the oranges, etc., where it's not such a problem.
Yeah, and I'm sort of trying to. I mean, obviously, I'm lucky because we're growing food, so a large percentage of my food is straight off the farm. But the question is, how much of your food is natural, raw, or lightly cooked? Because actually, half. I mean, in essence, half of the plate should be vegetables. Sorry, and half of your plate should be vegetables. So at least half of your diet, fruit and vegetables. How much of that is organic? When you can buy, organic, do. And just sort of having that way. And quite right with the dirty dozen, that's sometimes it's better if you can buy, organic berries than not. There are a lot of foods, berries are a classic example where, in season they're cheap and you can freeze them. And then you can eat blueberries in the winter, organic, and so on. And what's happening locally, that's really, really important. Try and find local suppliers and support them. So it's just like trying to get a chunk of what you eat, local, organic, certainly pesticide, herbicide free. And it's sort of more clear with pesticides. We've got to understand that if you have a nerve poison, which is what a pesticide is, which kills bugs, then the only difference between it and your consumption is it's had more than you. So it's sort of what accumulates. It's just like, the vaccine story. We know in America, they got to have whatever it is, 60 individual vaccine doses. A 5-in-1 counts as one, but you do it twice. So that becomes 10, many of which contain aluminium, which you never want to inject into your body. So the question is, what's the accumulative effect of aluminium? What's the accumulative effect of pesticides and herbicides? And the honest truth is we don't know. And the only people funding this research tend to be the people who are making it. So we just don't know. So I would say it's terrible. There isn't a single week. I mean, yesterday I heard of a young girl who dies from leukemia, relatively shortly after diagnosis. There's just so many of these sort of unusual or sort of rapid young cancer deaths without any clear explanation. So if you're cautious, don't eat foods with herbicides and pesticides.
And I loved your approach, Patrick, which very much epitomizes the angle we take within PHA and PFFA. If you can reach out at a local area, connect with your local farmers and try and work with them to find solutions, because, these farmers, they've all gone with what the salespeople are pushing on them. They're very, very busy people. They've been led down a path like so many others that they thought was for the best. And now we're all starting to realize it wasn't necessarily. So for people out there, come together with your community and go and very peacefully and supportingly connect with your farmers and producers. And if we all look at the local level, it doesn't seem so overwhelming. If everyone gets involved, local action has a national impact, then you don't need to be overwhelmed that it feels too big. If we all just play our role at a local level and start to fix it together, hopefully what we'll do is we'll suddenly see this big kind of national change start to happen.
Yeah,
moving forward.
Also sort of selling the sizzle, the plus side, not the sausage, so to speak, for farmers. I gave a talk recently called the Soil, Food, Gut, Brain Super High for Green Farm Collective. We had about 500 farmers there. And they were so motivated. Some of them were already doing regenerative farming, others were considering it. But their instinct, their feeling was that this was the right direction to go in. But they didn't really understand just how food affects the brain, dementia, mental health, cancer, and all those other things. And when they started to sort of see those connections, it gave them the motive to go in that direction. And I think it's like learning to ride a bicycle. One day you get it, you get this new distinction called balance, and you can't go back. It's just not possible. So my work with farmers is in making that that compulsive new distinction occur, which is actually they're very much part of the health revolution. and what they do makes a phenomenal difference. And similarly with the public, when they get that new distinction, it's abhorrent for them to be buying, the fake stuff, and then they're looking to local suppliers. Because, most people, in a sense, are not saying, I just want to buy organic or not organic. What they want, is to feel healthier, feel happier, and so on. And once those foods are associated with that, it's amazing. And if you do actually take a week where you're eating all, local, natural, organic produce, you feel better. Once you put those pieces together, it's and I think we'll start locally all over the place. Yeah. I heard of, there's a zerodig.net. They got a property developer, and every community where they're going to expand the village or town with more properties have to fulfill what's called Section 106. That is doing something for the community. And they've now got it registered that if they, on that little, let's say there's a few acres, they're going to build some properties. If they stick an half an acre or an acre of zero dig, it absolutely fulfills all the community requirements. So now we can imagine thousands of local communities, expansions, all having a zero dig project which people can participate in, getting food locally which they've grown. It's fantastic. Now my view is if you're trying to get rid of stinging nettles, let me give an example here, because that's what you'd use glyphosate for. I love stinging nettles because they make compost. So they're fantastic. And we've actually got a
They're a sign of fertility as well. I think people don't realize that you spot a place covered in stinging nettles, you've got some fertile land.
No, you've got fantastic nitrogen in the soil, and the roots are tremendous medicine as well. And so we've got a container. We have a lot of comfrey naturally and nettles, and we stick the nettles and the comfrey in the container, and out the bottom is a tap and a bucket, and drip, drip, drip. You get all this, sort of brown tea from the nettles and the comfrey, which is then fertilizing the soil. So the idea of trying to kill, all your nettles, not using them at all, is sort of a massive waste of resource.
Absolutely.
Yeah, no,
fantastic, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's absolutely fantastic information, which we appreciate.
My pleasure.
Thanks for your time.
Wasn't that fabulous? I just several points. I love the cumulative effect of glyphosate. We don't see, taste, or smell it, but that compound effect is significant. So I thank you, Patrick, for mentioning that. And the reference to nettles. Well, people who followed me for 5 minutes or more know that I love utilizing nettles. So that's another use there. And I made a pesticide with fermented nettles because I had aphids in my garden this summer, worked a treat. So there are lots of alternatives to glyphosate. So thank you, Patrick. I'm now going to introduce another Patrick. So I first heard Patrick Holden speak at the Food on Prescription conference. It was a few years ago now, Patrick, but that Dr. Dixon opened by saying we have urgent business. We are much more likely to poison ourselves before we have to address climate change and the rest of it. So I'm going to turn over to you now, really looking forward to what you have to say. And then we will take questions. And I have a few for you myself. So over to you, Patrick.
Hello, good evening, everyone. I don't know how many people are in the UK. Most of the people on this, are they?
UK, France, Canada, but most are here in the UK.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I've just been listening to my namesake, Patrick Holford, and oh, there we are, New Zealand. Fantastic. Okay, it's not just good evening then. It's also good morning. And to be honest, I don't want to be an echo chamber. I agree with everything. Yeah, very early. I agree with everything the other Patrick said. So I'm just thinking what more I could add to what he just shared with you. And maybe I should just tell my story, because I think really, I'm not a scientist, but I know people who are doing research on glyphosate Roundup in rats. A chap called Dr. now Professor Michael Antonio from King's College in London, same place as Tim Spector operates from, and also Chris Van Tulken. There seemed to be this incredible emergence of new, brilliant, world-leading scientists from that institution, and thank God they've arrived. And they are collectively doing research, including animal feeding trials involving glyphosate, the active ingredient of Roundup. And although, as the other Patrick just said, it's very difficult to isolate all the other confounding factors, or, you know, so that to get a trial with human beings, which is causative correlation, not cause, not correlation, is near on impossible. But all the emergent evidence suggests that we should make every possible effort to avoid, as much as we possibly can, exposure to pesticides, which is a generic name for fungicides, pesticides, and herbicides, all of those poisons, which are exactly what they are, in our food, because we're probably getting quite a lot of them anyway in the environment, just, you know, from our daily lives. We seem to be surrounded now by foreign substances that our bodies are not used to dealing with. And so in our food, we absolutely do need to minimize that. So, you know, maybe when I finish going on for a bit, I suggest that if there are questions that you have for me, any of you, you should just ask me, and maybe we can have a conversation, because that might be a more fruitful way of exploring what I might be able to share with you. But just to frame the discussion, I am a 60s child. I was a Londoner. I had childhood influences of nature and holidays, and a dad who was training to be a doctor, so we moved around a lot. And my parents bought a place in the Isle of Skye, which I found very inspiring, and still go to Skye. Both my brothers now live on Skye. And also my dad was in San Francisco, in the San Francisco Bay Area for a year as a visiting professor at Stanford. And that was a big influence on me. So long story cut short, all those cumulative influences germinated, and I decided to get back to the land, leave London and get back to the land in 1973 and set up a community farming project. And I'm speaking to you now from the same farm that the six of us arrived at in 1973, 50 years later, 50 years and 2 months later. We just had a series of parties to celebrate 50 years here over the summer. And actually also the 50th birthday of my daughter, Bali, who was born here shortly after we arrived. And what is amazing about being on a hill of 300 acres now, which is the area we farm, for a long time, is that you can see the action, the impact of your actions on outcomes. And what is clear to me and clear to anyone who comes here, we have more and more people coming here to look at exactly that, is that the place is thriving. We farmed organically since day one, although there weren't organic standards when I started. So me and a few other people got together in the 70s, end of the 70s and during the 80s, and wrote the organic standards. And I can immodestly claim to have written the first draft of the organic dairy standards because there weren't any. And somebody said, well, you're a dairy farmer, you might as well write them. And so I did. And so we have here, our farming enterprise consists of a dairy herd of around 90 cows, a native breed called Ayrshires, crossed with some French native breed animals called Normand, and a few shorthorns. And I've just literally been up in the field with them half an hour ago. And they are grazing lush grass, clover, and herbs. And they look a picture, and they're milking really well. And we've probably got a month's grass grazing ahead of them now. And during the last 50 years, we've used no nitrogen fertilizer, no pesticides, minimal antibiotics. We don't use any antibiotics in the udders of our cows. And we have farmed in harmony with nature, using biological cycles to build soil fertility. And although we have grown carrots on some scale for about 25 years, we're not growing them at the moment, only because the centralization of the supermarket sourcing made it impossible for us to get our carrots to the pack house that serves all the organic carrots that Waitrose and Sainsbury's sell, which is in Peterborough now, because they only have one pack house, one abattoir, one meat cutting plant, one processing operation for just all their foods, and I'll come to that shortly. So we were a casualty of supermarkets in a way. But the point is, and we do have a crop rotation, it's about 7 years, 5 years of herbal lay, as those of you who listen to the Archers will understand, to build the soil fertility. And then we have a couple of years of crops. And at the moment, our crops are oats and peas, which we feed to the cows. And it's interesting, the other Patrick just mentioned no dig and no till. And the plough, in our case, would destroy the fungal networks of the soil. And there's a huge regenerative agriculture movement in this country whose doctrine is no till and no plough. Well, because nothing's simple, the interesting point which emerges from that is that if you don't plough, it's very, very difficult to control the weeds that grow very well in the damp soils of the damp climate, particularly of Wales, but actually United Kingdom generally, without using a herbicide. So when you hear people talking about regenerative farming, the farmers and the food companies increasingly are talking about regenerative farming, including McCain's, who are advertising on Channel 4 and Channel 5 at the moment, going regen with their potatoes. Most of those farmers and food companies and retailers are actually using Roundup as part of their regenerative farming system. And so that is because they've demonized the plough, which I think used carefully and 2 or 3 times in a 7-year rotation and used in a shallow way, does little to offset the carbon gain and the fungal networks in the soil if you use it carefully and judiciously. But it does a brilliant job of weed control. So in a way, the farmers who have turned their back on the plough have boxed themselves into a corner where it's very difficult for them to farm without the use of Roundup. And I was on a farm in France, near Lille, almost exactly a year ago. I think it was last November, as part of an international gathering of food companies and retailers that were looking at, sustainable regenerative practices. And we went into this enormous field with the farmer there, and I was the only other farmer in the company, probably about 40 people there, mostly food executives. So this chap was talking about how he was growing regen crops for McCain's because he was growing potatoes in his rotation. And I said, well, what is your rotation? And he said, well, it's potatoes, wheat. I think he was growing some oilseed rape. And I said, well, how do you build fertility? And he said, we have these green cover crops in the winter. And that means that when the main crop, the summer crop, is harvested, we grow lots of vetches and clovers, and other crops as well, radishes and fodder beet and all sorts of things, which we put in the field to cover the soil during the winter, which is an excellent thing. But then I said, well, how do you get rid of that green cover crop in the spring? And he said, oh, we use Roundup. And then he puffed his chest out and said, well, I was actually part of a lobby group of French farmers that went to the French agriculture minister, who was minded to ban Roundup in France. And we managed to persuade him not to ban Roundup because we said it's part of a regenerative farming system. So how interesting is that even the farmers, and the other Patrick was quite right when he said there's a massive interest amongst the farming community in going regen now and farming in harmony with nature. But there is also equally a huge amount of confusion about the practices which will build soil carbon, regenerate soil fertility, build the health of the soil and the plants and the animals that depend on it, and produce healthy food for us all to eat. And I guess my 50-year journey on this farm, during which time I've had a couple of day jobs, one running in the Soil Association for about 15 years, and more recently with the Sustainable Food Trust, has given me deep knowledge of practice. And I'm hoping now that with a massive growth of interest in food and health, soil food and health, ultra-processed foods, which seems to be taking off. Interest in ultra-processed foods is just taking off amazingly all over the world, and the concern about what is done to our food when it leaves the farm gate. I'm hoping that this same level of public interest now is going to focus on farming practices and make sure that the agricultural transition, which needs to take place very urgently now, takes place in the right way with proper sustainable farming practices at their heart. So I'll talk a little bit about what I mean by proper sustainable farming practices. I mean, all this that I'm about to share with you really goes back a century, or nearly a century anyway, because the founders of the sustainable agriculture movement were around in the early part of the 20th century. They challenged the then orthodoxy, which is already starting to become more intensive. And people like Sir Albert Howard, Lady Eve Balfour, who if you are listening to Radio 4, by the way, I was the proposer for a program called Great Lives, which is presented by Matthew Paris. And the week before last, the great life was Lady Eve Balfour, the founder of the Soil Association. And I was the proposer. And it was a very interesting program. You can get it if you just look on BBC Sounds, look up Great Lives, and look up Lady Eve Balfour. And the program is there. It's about a 30-minute program. And it just tells you about the life of Lady Eve Balfour, who died in 1990. I actually spoke at her memorial service, so I did know her when she was the honorary vice president of the Soil Association. She wrote a book called The Living Soil in 1943, which was inspired by a book called An Agricultural Testament, both must-read books, written by Sir Albert Howard, who went to India, tasked by the British government at the time to teach the peasant farmers of northwest India, now Pakistan, how to adopt Western methods of agriculture. When he arrived, he realized that they knew far more than he did about sustainable agriculture. So he spent 35 years in the Hunza Valley and that part of then India, learning about their methods. And then he wrote this book, An Agricultural Testament, in 1940, which was his homage to what he'd learned about truly sustainable agriculture from these people who composted, who obeyed the law of return, who rotated their crops. And the thing that he noticed, which I think is profound, and it relates absolutely what the other Patrick was just saying, is that if you eat or feed plants or feed animals healthy food from a healthy soil, the result is the plants, animals, and people don't get sick. They have a health and positive health and a vitality, which enables them to resist pest and disease challenges. And we are witnessing that on this farm after 50 years. Our crops do not suffer from diseases. It's what also Patrick was talking about with these phytochemicals, which the plant's immune system, really, shorthand, which of course, if we eat those plants ourselves, vegetables that have all these phytochemicals in them, that transfers to promote our own immunity and our own health. And it's obvious when you think about it. And so for now 50 years, I've been practicing organic farming, developing the standards and the movement as we went along, and learned a lot along the road. And we've developed the organic market. And, the other Patrick's just been saying, eat as much organic food as you can. Well, I completely agree with him. But if you actually look at what's happening to our farming and food systems today, and this is kind of the sobering downside of this, what I'm sharing with you, we have never had more intensive and industrial farming. If you go into a supermarket, and most of us have to buy the food we eat, it's almost impossible to buy real food. And by real, I mean food which is properly grown, with a good sustainable story behind it, and not ultra processed. You probably come across Chris Van Tulken and his Ultra Processed People book, which I would strongly recommend anyone to read. Ultra Processed People, it's a bestseller at the moment. I just read it and I learned so much. And basically, his whole focus is on what happens to the raw materials which are produced intensively, which are the feedstock for nearly all the foods that supermarkets sell. And his estimation is that 65% of all the foods that are currently sold in supermarkets are ultra processed. And his definition of ultra processed is that, again, as the other Patrick implied, they have processing aids and additives in them, most of which are used because they either extend the shelf life of the foods or they improve its apparent palatability. There's a term called mouthfeel, which sounds pretty sinister, which is basically, you know, emulsifiers and things like that make the food feel better in the mouth. Or they mimic, in the case of some of the additives, the flavors that the raw materials don't have anymore because they come from industrial farming. And ironically, when we first came here in 1973, we started dairy farming right at the beginning. And we used to send our milk to a factory which made butter and milk powder just down the road from here, a place called Wellenbach. And there used to be 3,000 dairy farmers supplying that creamery. It was in the days of the Milk Marketing Board then, and we were still producing milk in churns. And today, that factory has disappeared, but there's still a factory there, and it's called Sensient. And this factory makes artificial flavors for foods to trick our palates into thinking that the foods are tasty when they're not. So it'd be additives to crisps and all those kind of foods. Well, lots, a whole range. And this chemistry, which are part of the additives which produce ultra-processed food, has now replaced real food processing, which of course, you know, many of the foods we eat are processed. I mean, bread is processed, and so is cheese, because we turn all our milk into a single farm cheese here, which we produce on the farm. And that is another form of processing, but it's very, very different from the processing that goes into most of the food that most people eat. And if you do read Ultra Processed People, I think you'll emerge from having read that book with thinking, oh my God, I had no idea how much of the food I'm currently buying is UPF. And then you'll think, okay, well, I'll try to avoid it. I'll go down to my local supermarket and I'll see what I can get. So you will be able to get quite a lot of non-UPF food in your supermarket. You'll get fresh vegetables and fruits. You'll be able to buy dairy products. You won't be able to buy any bread, because all the breads that all supermarkets sell is UPF, because they put emulsifiers and God knows what else in it to make, using this method developed called the Chorley Wood method, which is basically a form of adulteration of real bread. And so I may be wrong, I don't think there's a single supermarket which produces real bread, you know, bread which is not ultra processed, which is slow bread, sourdough, that proper sourdough. Lots of supermarkets will tell you they sell sourdough, but it isn't real sourdough, it's fake sourdough. And so you look around and you try to go into a supermarket and think, okay, can I buy any real food here? And so I'd say my definition of real food is food that isn't ultra processed, obviously, food with a sustainable story behind it, with a production method you can find out about. And in an ideal world, know something about the person who produced it. So, yeah, food with provenance, known provenance from a sustainable farming system, not ultra processed. And I'm not anti the people who run the supermarkets, and I'd like to mention that in a minute as well. I think that they're just human beings who, you know, done well and got to be boss of a big retail operation or a big food company. Most of them have got children. Most of them don't know what to do about the dawning realization that they're all having, that their supermarket, their food company, in terms of climate change, loss of biodiversity, and declining public health, is actually at the heart of the problem. And it's a shocking and sobering realization to come to, that we are a nation which is in the second generation of a feeding trial, where we have intensified our agriculture, processed the crap out of all our food, and fed it to 2 generations of people. And it's got so much bad now that it's very, very difficult to buy real food in any of the UK supermarkets. So we're at the low point. I'm going to tell this against myself now. So I was very involved with the development of the organic movement. I wrote, as I said, I was involved with drafting the livestock standards. I was involved with the development of the international organic movement. And you could say, if you wanted to look at the glass half full, you could say it's very successful. But against that, after 40 years of being involved with it, it's, if you're really generous, only 2 or 3% of the total food market. The vast majority of the food that is produced, processed, and eaten in this country comes from intensive and semi-intensive food systems, is processed or ultra processed, and is probably making people sick. And I think that Patrick's reference, the other Patrick's reference to the extraordinary rise of a whole range of previously uncommon diseases, ranging from obesity, diabetes, food intolerances, which are going off the charts, just general diseases of the immune system, allergies, and yes, cancers. I would, again, it's to Patrick's point, it's very difficult to prove this, but I would say that for me, it's a virtual certainty now that many of the root causes of this extraordinary rise in disease, previously uncommon diseases, which are now threatening to bankrupt the health service and which are shortening our lives, and which, according to Patrick, Chris Van Tulken, who I heard speak in Sussex last week, he said, now, if you look at 8 to 10-year-olds and you line up against, from the UK, and you line them up against 8 to 10-year-olds from European countries who are also eating ultra-processed food, but far less of it, there's a 4 or 5 inch difference in height. So basically, we've got a young generation of children growing up on UPF who are stunted, who are nutritionally deficient, and they cannot grow, they cannot express their full health potential. They're probably going to die younger than my generation. And what a shocking thing it is that we've done all that. And the saddest thing of all is that there's massive confusion out there amongst the public about what people should eat, and even whether there's anything wrong with the food system. And there's a huge amount of prejudice against organic food. I was just listening to a brilliant podcast by Tim Spector, actually, just this evening about organic food, which is definitely a must listen. He does regular podcasts, and you should, download that and listen to it. I just literally found out about it today. But for most people, they probably have a prejudice about organic food. They say, well, it's very expensive. Well, I'm not sure if it's better for you. Some people say it is, but it may be marketing hype from the food companies. Why is it so expensive? Blah, blah, blah. And also, I should probably go to a plant-based diet because animal fats are bad for you. Cows belch methane, which is a potent greenhouse gas. And anyway, most livestock production today is intensive and horrible. So I would like to speak about all those things, wrapping them up together from my own experience, because I think this is relevant to probably this is ground that the other Patrick didn't cover. So if I ask myself, how should I farm to be part of the solution? Here's what I'd say, and this is what we're doing here. We should farm without any chemical fertilizers or pesticides. We've been doing that for 50 years. We should base our food production, if it isn't just perennial, like trees or pastures which are not reseeded, with annual crops, on a crop rotation which has a fertility building phase. It could be a different range of things, but in our case, it's a herbal pasture which we sow and leave down for about 5 or 6 years, which builds up the soil carbon and the life of the soil. And then, in our case, as I mentioned earlier, we plow that up and we grow a succession of crops, in our case, oats and peas, and it used to be carrots as well. And that rotation and on our farm, even though it's a livestock farm, we have about 150 cattle on this farm, and we produce milk and cheese, is carbon negative according to the best analysis we can make. And so some of you are thinking, well, I've given up eating meat, or I'm eating a lot less meat, and I'm eating especially less red meat and dairy products, because everyone says that ruminant animals are part of the problem. I would say this, that our animals, which are mainly grass-fed, apart from the oats and peas which we grow, are mob grazed on the pastures, and this is a system of grazing which more and more livestock farmers are adopting. They're grazed intensively and then moved on after 24 or 48 hours. And if you do that, the combination of the grazing action of the animals and the trampling of their hooves and their manure and their urine actually builds soil and builds soil carbon. So from the best evidence we've got at the moment, the soil carbon which we are sequestering in our soils more than offsets the total methane emissions of the animals and indeed our energy use, because obviously we use diesel electricity on this farm because we make silage and hay and all that kind of thing. So we are actually a carbon negative grazing livestock farm. And even if some of you might say, well, I don't eat livestock products because I have ethical objections, fair enough. But even if you are an arable farmer, not in wet West Wales, where I'm speaking to you from, but say in the eastern counties where you have incredibly fertile soils and a drier climate and you can grow more plants in your rotation, you still have to have a fertility building phase in that rotation. The best form of fertility building is a clover grass ley, which I mentioned earlier. And the best way to turn that 50% of the rotation into food that the people who don't mind eating livestock products can eat is with grazing animals. So structurally, sustainably managed livestock are an integral part of a truly sustainable farming system. Now, some of you might say, oh, I read George Monbiot's book and I read about Tolly, George's favorite English organic farmer, who's an old friend of mine. And it is possible, and he said in his book, and he's right, George Monbiot said, you can produce very good vegetables and fruit in farming in a vegan way. And Tolly is more or less vegan. It is true that if you have bio-intensive horticulture and you use composting and green manures, which are short-term green manures, and you look after the soil in the way that Ian Tolhurst does, you can definitely grow good vegetables in an intensive horticultural operation. And I have a very good friend just down the road from here called Peter Seger, who's he's vegetarian. He used to have sheep on his farm, but they kept escaping and eating his vegetables. So in the end, he gave them up. And he has an extensive composting operation, which includes some animal manures, which he buys or gets from neighbours. And he does a lot of chipping of his hedgerows, and all the vegetable waste goes into this composting system. And he's producing fantastic vegetables in a more or less stockless system. But if you move to a larger scale agriculture, I would say, and I think most people would agree with this, that it's very difficult to build soil fertility and build carbon unless you have a rotation which includes several years of grass or equivalent fertility building. And if you want to turn that into food and money, then you need livestock. And another prejudice about what I'm describing here is that, oh, it's all very well farming organically and doing all this sort of thing, but you'll never feed the world. So my organization, the Sustainable Food Trust, recently did a desk study, notionally transitioning the whole of the United Kingdom to regenerative organic, proper regenerative organic farming, because we wanted to know the answer to this question. What would be the result of a UK-wide transition to sustainable agriculture? And what would be the dietary implications of that transition if I said to myself, I'd like my future diet to be aligned with the productive capacity of what farmers would produce if they went through that transition? So we did the maths, and you can download this report, Feeding Britain from the Ground Up, from our website. And if I just give you the sort of headlines, what would be the outcome of a UK-wide transition? Grain production would fall dramatically by over 50%. But that's because we'd be growing less grain because we'd be building fertility even on these arable farms. And yes, Gabe Brown, wonderful man, by the way, fantastic guy. He's one of the pioneer organic farmers or regenerative farmers in North America. He gets all this stuff that I'm talking to you about. So we'd have less grain available, but 50% of the current grain, which is produced in the UK, is fed to intensive livestock. So it's the end of cheap chicken. No more cheap chicken. And chicken would be like it was when I was growing up, an expensive treat that maybe once a month if you ate that, if you liked eating chicken. So in fact, a sustainable diet would be lots of vegetables. Patrick said that, he's right. Lots of seasonal fruits, he's right there. Lentils and pulses if you want to eat them, and nuts and all those kind of things. But also, if you're that way inclined, grass-fed red meat from a country which is 65% grassland. So the United Kingdom is a grass nation. So in fact, we can be and should be a grass-fed nation, not exclusively, but even the vegetables that we grow probably derive their fertility on a field scale anyway from the fertility-giving properties of grassland. So I would say that if you want to eat livestock products with a clear conscience as part of this sustainable diet, seek out, and again, I agree with Patrick, this is actions that you could undertake. Make yourself a pledge that you will derive as great as possible a percentage of the foods you eat, the staples now, the staple foods that could be produced in this country from producers who are farming in a sustainable way and ideally near to where you live. Don't beat yourself up if you're currently shopping in a supermarket. I mean, I was in Tesco's local in Bristol last week because I had to get whatever it was, some organic milk and stuff, you know. But make it clear to the customer service desk, if you can be bothered, that you want real food with a sustainable story behind it. You want organic products where possible, because that's a shorthand for properly grown. It's not the only system, but it's a good system. You can trust it, which is exactly what Tim Spector said on this podcast. And if you can't get the food that you want from a supermarket, which you sadly will not be able to do, but they could supply it if they change their practices, then don't shop there. You know, find a box scheme. Mm-hmm. There's Riverford, of course. There's other smaller local box schemes. Support a farmer's market. Go online and find. I mean, just to give you an example of that, why this matters. We sell a cheese called Havod, and if you want to follow us on Instagram, it's HAFOD cheese at Havod cheese, and we have about 4,000 followers on our Instagram, and we produce Havod cheddar, which is a high end, if you want to call it that. It's just a real cheese. You know, it's produced the proper fermentation process, exclusive in the milk of our cows, and we sell it at £15 a kilo, ex-dairy wholesale. But by the time it gets into shops like Neal's Yard Dairy in London, it's very expensive because, you know, there's just markup and all that sort of stuff. But we are selling all the cheese that we produce, but only just. So even though we're producing about 30 tons of cheese a year, and we also produce ruby veal, which is veal from our male dairy calves, because they're a structural part of a dairy farming system. You know, 50% of the calves are male unless you use sex semen. So we have delicious ruby veal, and we have cheddar, which are our key foods that we produce. We need more people to buy them. So this is not just a theoretical thing I'm saying to you. It really matters that you support the farmers in your area, because they are struggling. If they're farming organically as we are, and they're relatively small scale, and they're, you know, trying to sell their food on a local market and trying not to be commodity slaves supplying supermarkets, it's hard. So if you can afford to spend more on real food, you should do that, because it'll help. It will be the change we need to see. Really, your buying power, I don't know what it is that the average per capita spend on food is these days, but whatever it is, you know, you spend that much on money on food a year. If you use your buying power to support the change that I've been describing, this will have an effect, and it will make a huge difference. So I'll stop there and see whether anybody wants to ask some questions. Havod cheese, that's it. Yeah. And my wife, by the way, Becky, she does all the posts, and it's lovely. And you'll see if you go onto her Instagram, there's some wonderful stories about, you know, what you might call the secret life of animals. In other words, when you work with cows, milking cows, it's amazing. You see so much that you don't notice if you're not looking. And there's a cow called Oats and Peas, who's the leader cow in our herd. And you'll see a film of her which Becky took the other day. it's amazing what goes on real farms, and we all ought to be reconnected with them.
Well, I have a couple of questions, but I'll hold back if anyone else has a question.
Why is it so difficult? What's difficult? I haven't got the chat up. Can you be the interpreter of the chat?
Let's see.
The question is, why is it so difficult to buy raw milk in the UK?
Okay, that's a good question. You're not allowed to buy raw milk through an intermediary. So the only way you can buy raw milk is because of the Food Standards Agency and their stupidity. Sorry to say that, but we have institutional stupidity and a pathological fear of bacteria, which has gone right through the whole food industry of this country. And if you try to do things like sell raw milk or make a raw milk cheese as we do, you live in mortal daily fear of the environmental health officers who can come and close you down if you do anything wrong. And I could rant on about this for some time, but anyway, one of the consequences of that is that because of a fear about pathogens getting into raw milk, which could make people sick, the powers that be have decided that farmers can only sell their milk directly to customers like you if you wanted to buy it. So more and more dairy farmers are putting in vending machines. Some of them pasteurize their milk because it just, it's less hassle, and others don't. And you are allowed to sell raw milk directly in a vending machine, or you can have a franchise in a shop. So, I could say to the shop in Lampeter, which is called Watson and Pratt's, where some of our cheese is sold, why don't I put a raw milk vending machine in your shop, and I keep the title of the milk, and then your customers can go and buy it. We're not doing that because we're making cheese, and we're trying to make one thing well. And if we diversified into raw milk sales in a very depopulated rural area, it would just be challenging for us. Some people will put it in the post though, but that's the short answer. It's difficult because the regulations are against us and the culture is against us. It's very sad, really. But you can get it if you're persistent. And I predict that more people in time will buy raw milk because it's better for you. There was an American scientist called Pottinger who wrote a book called Pottinger's Cats, and he fed cats. Is probably a bit, people who don't like laboratory animals, this is a bit distasteful, but he fed cats on sterilized milk, raw milk, and pasteurized milk. And the cats on the sterilized milk died. And there appeared to be no difference between the cats on the raw milk and the pasteurized milk. But in the second generation, differences emerged in, I think, litter size, fertility, skin conditions, that sort of thing. And I would say that's very analogous to the feeding trial that I described earlier. We're all part of a feeding trial where we eat crap and see what happens to our children and our grandchildren. And you'll know, I'm sure many of you, about epigenetic, the science of epigenetics, where what we eat and the environment we live in doesn't just affect us, it passes down to our offspring.
Well, that's a great point that Dr. Zach Bush brings up and says we are now seeing the third generation of glyphosate babies. But I'm going to leave that because we could be on for hours with that. But one question I have is, well, I live in Honiton and we banned glyphosate about 18 months ago. And I was just speaking we now have a new district counselor who's heading up the that sort of program. And they're trying alternatives to glyphosate. One thing they're trying is some sort of a boiling water spray. And he's going to invite me to their inaugural trial in about a week's time. So that's really good news. And we want to educate the residents as well, which some of them are not very happy. But now we're going to have this land where maybe little pockets of land where we could get some veg patches going, get some allotments going. But if the soil has been sprayed, what can we do to make it safe to grow veg? Do we remove topsoil, or?
Do you mean with glyphosate?
Yeah, it's been sprayed with glyphosate.
I've got no science to make the statement, but nature is a great healer. Glyphosate does degrade in time, And I think if it's really been terribly heavily sprayed, obviously that's a big deal. But I think we just have to accept that we live in a contaminated world. I mean, in America, Roundup is so widely used that it now comes down in the rain, it's in breast milk, it's in our body fluids. You know, it's getting everywhere. And I think we just have to stop using it and hope that nature can sort it out. By the way, Patrick didn't mention this, but one of the uses of Roundup, he mentioned that it was used as a, he might have not have used this word, but it's used as a pre-harvest desiccant. And that means, yes, he did mention this, that about a week before harvesting wheat, what farmers do is they spray their grain with Roundup. And they do that because it kills the grain, which makes it drier quicker. It also kills all the weeds which are growing in the straw of the crop. And that way, when the combine harvester gets into the field, it can go faster. So it's just used for that. But what it means is that if you buy and eat non-organic bread, you are guaranteed to have quite a high intake of Roundup, because this is more or less universal practice. So, you know, really, there's so much Roundup getting into our food now that I would say that if you are able to use some land which has got a history of Roundup, as long as you're not using it anymore, it'll heal itself.
Can we test for glyphosate in the soil? I guess that's
yes, you can. Yeah,
okay.
Yes, I think you can. I can't give you chapter and verse on the lab, but glyphosate testing is getting more and more available now, and there are lots of people who are doing that sort of thing. And it was interesting that Tim Spector is, you know, he's got the Zoe project, but in parallel with that, with some of his colleagues, he's looking at glyphosate residues in the microbiome now. So, you know, there's more and more people on this now. So I predict it's only a matter of time before Roundup will be banned everywhere, because there's no doubt about it. It's highly disruptive to our health. And I agree with what Patrick said. You know, we may not have absolutely rock solid causative evidence yet, but you know, the writing's on the wall. I mean, why are all these previously uncommon diseases going up? And you mentioned Zach Bush, he's convinced about this.
Well, we're going to hear from Dr. Seneff in a few minutes, and she'll answer some of these questions. I have one practical question. So I'm thinking of you mentioned shopping. I'm thinking of families, young families, they've on a budget and they've got to feed their kids. And you being the head of the Soil Association, which is a great resource, how is there?
I was the head of the Soil Association. That's Helen Browning now, but I'm now the head of the Sustainable Food Trust. But we're doing parallel work.
But how could a young mom shop and prioritize? You know, you mentioned wheat getting those 2 sprays. I know chickpeas get sprayed a lot, and hummus is very popular now. Lentils, you'd be eating glyphosate pills. How can a mom easily prioritize her shopping to avoid the foods that get most spray?
I mean, obviously, the more you cook, the better, because you can actually live on quite a modest budget if you're prepared to cook. Mm-hmm. And you know, that's difficult. I know it's difficult for people who work, and if you are in the sort of 20% of the population for whom affordability of food is a huge issue, and maybe even more than that now because of everything that's happened recently, it's a huge problem, and the government ought to be doing more about that with green food stamps and free meals and all the things that you know, everyone's talking about. But I think if you can bear it, it is possible, especially if you buy direct from the farm and you're prepared to cook, to live pretty well if you just buy in season simple foods. And you can get, you know, you should be able to get them organically. Obviously, you can grow some yourself. That's great if you have the garden or whatever. But I think just make a direct relationship with, if you're not in the middle of a city, find farmers that you can build a trusting relationship with, and buy in season and all that kind of thing, and go online. And, you know, I mean, we sell, just an example, we sell cooking cheese, you know, which is just offcuts. It's just the same as the cheese we sell for much more money. Mm-hmm. But if somebody wanted to buy our cooking cheese directly from us, they could. You know, I'm not saying we want to get into a great big mail order system, but I mean, we're here. and near where you live, there are going to be people like us who, are trying to make a living and want to supply local markets and don't know who the people are that want to buy their food. So I think we just got to make efforts as individual citizens and see who's around us.
And be determined. Thank you so much. Honestly.
Be determined, because what's at stake is not just our health, but our health of the planet. Because the sort of farming systems we're doing here are critically important if we want to avoid irreversible climate change, loss of nature, and obviously a health catastrophe. So it starts with our health, but it's much wider than that.
Thank you so much. I hope we can have you back, because we have a couple more summits planned, but I could go on talking to you forever. It's been fascinating. Thank you so much for joining us.
No worries. Okay.
Great.
Bye,
well,
everyone.
I'm going to take over now. I am Patricia, the Health Revolution activist, and I'm going to talk now about something that is a little bit of a introduction from Patrick. There was wheat. So I'm going to talk about bread. So I'm going to share my screen and hope that I see my slides have been playing around while we did that. And I'll bring this up and get things in the right order eventually. I've just enjoyed this so much. It's been fantastic. There we go. Is that going to go? There we are. Get this out of the way. There we are. So we heard a little bit about wheat, and I'm going to take it into a little more detail now. So I am Patricia, the Health Revolution activist, and I've been speaking publicly on 4 areas of toxins affecting us and our environment for about 6 years. And one of those toxins, of course, is glyphosate. And I'm getting louder and louder now about that. And gradually over the last sort of 5 years, and really ramping up the last 3 years, people that I am helping coaching with their various health issues, the majority of them were saying they stopped eating bread. And not many of them were actually diagnosed gluten intolerant. They just assumed because they had a little bloating after eating bread or some other gut issues that they were gluten intolerant. And of course, most of their friends were, so it just made sense. So turning to the free from options left them just giving up on bread altogether. So they're missing out on an entire food group. So what is so bad about bread today? Well, let's have a look, and maybe some things will be a bit of a surprise for you. So we're going to go back in time. Some of you might recognize Peabody and Sherman and their Wayback Machine. So we're going to look at bread historically and compare it to what we call bread today. Then I will show you how you can go back in time and enjoy bread again. So why then has bread been a staple food for thousands of years, and now it's number one, public enemy number one? Well, bread is mentioned in the Bible as the staff of life. Jesus is the bread of life. Bread has been used in communion way before wafers were made. The breadwinner was the head of the household. Every culture on earth has their own form of bread. And ages ago, people ate the wheat head right off the stalk. And then they ground it when possible and added water or milk if they were fortunate enough. And that was sort of a gruel that they ate. And often they cooked flatbread on open fires. And then when communal ovens were available, bread more like what we eat now was enjoyed. And those lovely decorative designs that we see on loaves of bread were the signature back then, so people could identify their loaves when several loaves were baked, all at one time. And home ovens weren't even a thing yet. Can you imagine? So that sort of begs the question, is it gluten intolerance or glyphosate intolerance? So the Roman and Egyptian armies just thrived on bread. So what happened then? Well, fortunately, we have loads of Egyptian hieroglyphics showing people growing their own wheat, grinding wheat, mixing dough, baking bread, selling it, and eating it, and very clear images. So trade routes for Roman armies are preserved on papyri that show us how and where the grain was transported. And interesting, I find that a standing army of 20,000 men needed 6 tons of grain a day. That's massive. And one significant distinction, of course, is that the grain was not sprayed with pesticides. No Monsanto then. The grain, of course, was stone ground. That's all they had. And for leavened bread, they used a natural starter. No Mr. Fleischmann's with his packets of yeast. And the bread was left to prove for several days. There was no hurry, no refrigeration. And of course, bread was just flour and water. Fortunate people had salt, that came a little later. And then olive oil, fat, and milk were added to make a type of gruel that I mentioned. And if ovens were available, they could bake it. So grain was used in so many ways. But the Industrial Revolution changed things. The highly nutritious whole grain head could be taken apart. The natural omega oils could be removed and sold to the cosmetic and pharmaceutical companies for a lot of money, more money than they could get from a few loaves of bread. And they told the public it was to give the flour and bread a long shelf life. Well, my flour and bread do not need a shelf life. I eat half a loaf of bread a day. And also, stone grinding was slow and time is money. Roller milling was developed to be much faster. And it also allowed the different layers to be separated. So you can see all these wonderful layers in the wheat head. And the bran could be removed. So white flour was born. You see that the majority of the wheat head is that white endosperm, which is just starch. And making white flour was much easier to produce, and cheaper to sell. And then they learned about fractionating, which allowed manipulation of flour to be stripped of its nutrients. And this life-giving food no longer resembles the food of our ancestors. Shockingly, another nutrient that was more recently in the last, I think, probably 3 or 4 decades stripped from flour is glutathione. And glutathione is being talked about a lot recently. I give talks on glutathione because it's so vitally important. And I do have a recording, which I'd be happy to share, which compares different types of glutathione and which is most bioavailable. So if you'd like that, message me. I'll share my details at the end, and I'll be glad to send you a copy. So knowing that it naturally occurs in wheat, but was removed because it makes our bread too dense. We like our bread soft and fluffy. And then with the introduction of glyphosate, the natural minerals and vitamins and amino acids were destroyed. And this is due to wheat getting sprayed twice, as Patrick mentioned, and with glyphosate, which glyphosate has just become the poster child for pesticides. But we're going to learn more about this from Dr. Steniff and Kelly, who's speaking just after me. But glyphosate is sprayed a second time to dry the wheat out, as Patrick said. It's as a desiccant, and it does not dissipate, and it does not wash off, and it penetrates the wheat and destroys something called the shikimate pathway. Now, we're going to hear more about that from Dr. Steniff, but I'm mentioning it now because that's probably a new word, and if you hear it several times, it'll become more familiar because it's really key to what we're focusing on today. So that we now have a food that is toxic with side effects and no nutrients. Did you know chickens won't eat white bread? Wholemeal bread is not much better. Multigrain is misleading as well. So no commercial bread is fit for human consumption. Even artisan bread is not really safe. So let's have a look. Let's compare. So you know the difference in wheat that is sprayed and not sprayed. let's look at the difference between how commercial and homemade breads are made. So I looked at the ingredients on a very popular loaf of bread, and look what's in it. It's got wheat flour, but in parentheses, they have to add calcium, iron, niacin, and thiamine. So I questioned, well, what sort of calcium is that? Several years ago, or not that many years ago, but coral calcium was very popular as a supplement. And it was shortly found that because the molecule was so large, it was causing heart problems when the blood passed through the heart. And then, of course, I want to know, well, what kind of iron is that? And what type of niacin and thiamine? It's got to be the cheapest varieties, of course. And then they add yeast. So they're using commercial yeast. It's not the same as trapping those wonderful and activating those wonderful yeasts and bacterias. And they have rapeseed oil. Now, rapeseed gets doused with glyphosate. So ask yourself, when was the last time you saw a bee near a field of rapeseed? They're smart enough to leave. And why on earth would you add soya, which is GMO, to wheat flour for bread? And then preservatives, E numbers, flour treatments. Oh my gosh, a little cursory vitamin C, another E number, and flavoring. It just, Patrick Holden mentioned what they're doing to our foods to trick our palates into thinking that this processed food is better. And then another thing important to know is that vinegar can be added so that they can call it sourdough. And that's oftentimes what is in some shop-bought sourdough bread, but even some of the artisan sourdough breads. So they have fewer ingredients, which is encouraging, but very often it's still just white flour, and white flour just does not have any nutrients, if many at all. And of course, it doesn't have the fiber. So one problem with white bread is because it's lacking the fiber, it can form little teeny tiny microscopic little dough balls, and those can catch in the wall of your intestine, and they can push out the wall a little bit and then form a little pocket where they sit and just sort of fester. That can lead to diverticulitis. And so that with the sourdough bread in the farmers markets, next time you go, compliment the baker who's usually standing behind the table, compliment them on their gorgeous bread, and then ask them, do they use organic flour? They're breathing it in when they're baking, so they really should, but ask them if they do. Then ask them if their flour is stone ground, and hopefully they will say yes, but they may not even know. A lot of flour packets say milled. That doesn't necessarily mean stone ground. And if you're getting some positive answers, then ask them if they sprout the whole grain and grind it themselves. That would be very interesting. And I would hope you could find somebody, but I haven't yet, except the person I'm going to mention in a minute, but he's not a traditional baker. Look at the difference with homemade sourdough bread. And the one that I'm going to share with you is sprouted organic whole grain flour that's been stone ground. That is absolutely the best. That is the flour that bread was made that we talked about historically. And it digests in a couple of hours because that wheat is ripped and shredded so that our bodies have to work to digest it, whereas the white commercial breads digest in about 30 minutes. So then you're hungry and then you're eating something else. So the best bread is organic, sprouted, whole grain, stone ground, long fermented sourdough bread. That's the way bread should be. So I am going to share a discovery that I made quite a few years ago. I was looking for organic flour near me, and the gift of bread popped up. Never heard of it. It was 20 minutes for me. So I scooted over and met Michael and Nelica Story, who started the gift of bread, because they wanted everyone to know how to make proper bread. And my initial visit, I was there for 2 hours. We had so much to talk about. But what Michael does is gets whole grain, so organic whole grain, which he now gets from Somerset. Before, he was having imported whole grain, but he doesn't have to rely on the Ukraine or Canada or anybody else. It's Somerset grown whole grain, and he sprouts it for 24 hours. That's significant because it modifies the starch, and in modifying that starch, it means that people who are diabetics can eat this bread and not gain weight. The rest of us can eat they don't get an insulin spike either. And the rest of us can eat all we want and not gain weight. So Michael, interestingly, has been celiac all his life, nearly died as a teen. So he has done loads of research on the science and the archives, the history of wheat and bread, until he was able to make a bread that he could eat. And this is not a gluten-free or some other manipulated bread. This is proper sourdough bread eaten for thousands of years. And part of the secret is the sprouting, but another big secret is the natural starter made just from flour and water. And then he mixes it with flour. Once the starter's developed, he mixes it with flour and water and salt and leaves it for 3 days. And that 3-day process modifies the gluten. So this is not gluten-free bread. This is gluten-modified bread. So all the nutrients are intact, but the gluten is modified over those 3 days so that Michael, who is seriously celiac, can eat it. And he and I have both, gosh, I don't know how many people we've gotten on this bread, but I work with a lot of people who are gluten intolerant, as I mentioned. And about 90 to 95% of the people that Michael and I have gotten started on this bread can tolerate it and thrive on it without a problem. So a lot of that food manipulation that Patrick Holden mentioned is a contributing factor, a lot of gut issues. And I'll show you something in a minute. So let's get ahead to that. So this right here is Michael's dough this is a process that I now do. So you mix the starter when it's ready to go with flour, water, and salt, pop it in a container. So this black line that you see is where the dough was when I first put it in that container. And then you just chuck in the fridge. 3 days in the fridge, you don't do a thing with it. And look what it's done in those 3 days. You see those little pockets of air in there. Those are the bacteria releasing those gases, the natural yeast as well. So it's doubled on its own in the fridge without me doing anything. So then you take it out, shape it, put it in a proving basket, leave it overnight, and bake it the next day. Very little hands-on, very little. And in Michael's class, what you can expect is he will have this dough ready to go and teach you how to shape it. So that's very, very important. And then you set it aside and let it prove. He's got a way to sort of speed it up so it's not overnight, you're not sleeping over. And then he teaches you how to mix the dough, just some great tips to get the best process. But he gives you a lengthy history. I just skimmed the surface. He gives you a lengthy, in-depth history of wheat over the centuries, and just it was just really, really eye-opening. Of course, you take your lunch and you have a great day, and when you leave with a head full of knowledge, but a loaf of bread that you've baked yourself, a box of this dough, so it's enough to make 3 600-gram loaves or 2 900-gram loaves, and then a starter to keep you going. And he gives you, all the instruction that you need. So these are loaves of bread that I made myself with Michael's method in my non-spectacular kitchen, no commercial oven. And I mentioned that it's flour, water, and salt, but you can add things to it. So you can see I add nuts and seeds. Patrick Holford mentioned nettles. I'm a fan of eating nettles. They are free. They are full of vitamins and minerals. Gosh, I think I'm going to write a nettle book because there's so many attributes of nettles, and they're free. And then you see to the right is crackers. So you can make crumpets. In the middle, you can see the crumpets, and then little decorative things that you can do. But those crackers are so delicious, and you can eat all you want. So here's some aspects of this bread. So women who eat whole grains weigh less. Who's that good news for? Whole grains reduce the risk of metabolic syndrome. Whole grains substantially lower type 2 diabetes risk, 13% lower risk of developing gallstones. Whole grains promote women's health and gastrointestinal health. And the fact that only wheat bran, and not corn or oat bran, but wheat, is beneficial in preventing cancer-promoting changes in the colon, and provides additional clues that when wheat bran contains something that special, it makes it a true cancer fighter. And I was in my mid-50s, I was at high risk, 57 percentile risk for colon cancer. I'm 72 now and no longer at risk, symptom-free, and that little invasive procedure that we have from time to time confirms that I have a very healthy colon. I've been doing other things as well, but I've not wavered from this bread. I eat it absolutely every single day. And then whole grain betaine lessens chronic inflammation. Whole grains and fish are highly protective against childhood asthma. So I say, change your bread and change your life. If you're listening in America, I've mentioned Michael, and you might not pop over for class, but I have found one mill that in America that does provide organic sprouted, stone ground, whole grain flour. So get in touch and I'll be glad to share that link. So it does take a bit of patience because you're working with a live dough. This is a bowl that I just put flour, water in, put a plate on top, and left it for a few days. And those bacteria know what to do because they're already on the wheat, and they're activated by water and temperature sensitive. But the smell and handling that live responsive dough is a wonderful experience. So with a bit of patience and some time and the right temperature, you can be enjoying a traditional way of cooking. Working with natural yeast and bacteria allows us to partner with nature the way our ancestors did. Most of us can't imagine not having a fridge, but refrigeration hasn't done us any favors in many ways. So preserving food by fermenting was a way of life for thousands of years. Fermented sauerkraut is something else you can make yourself. And it's gaining a lot of attention now since we learned people in Eastern European countries who traditionally make fermented sauerkraut had far less incidence of COVID. And I've also read reports that having a couple of tablespoons of fermented, not pickled, fermented sauerkraut with a couple meals a day helps to usher glyphosate out of our bodies so that it doesn't build up. And most of us, if we were tested today, would have glyphosate in our urine. So populating our gut naturally with the right bacteria strains takes care of the bad guys. And buying sauerkraut from shops is not the same. Most of it has to be pasteurized so that it has a long shelf life. And I bought some a few years ago. I was just curious. I put it in the fridge and it went moldy in about 5 days. So you can make your own fermented sauerkraut enough to last 2 or 3 months for just pennies. So I have recorded a step-by-step video showing you how to make your own fermented sauerkraut. And that will be available with a recording when we get that to you. So have a play, and it's good family fun. So if you'd like to get in touch, if you'd like that recording on glutathione, if you'd like the link to the Flower in America, you can find me on Facebook, Instagram, WhatsApp, or email me. You might want to take a screenshot of that. And if you want to contact Michael Story, it's at thegiftofbread.org. And I thank you so much for listening. So now it is my pleasure to stop sharing for a second and introduce you to our next speaker, who is someone who made a huge impact on my life. She was a journalist living in California. Similar to me, she had some health issues, and her doctor said he couldn't really do any more for her. So she was forced to sort out herself. When she did, she learned about glyphosate and the role that it was playing in her health. And it just so happened very shortly after that, she learned that Monsanto was being taken to trial to see if glyphosate caused cancer. She attended that trial and 2 more. And she shared what she was learning day by day in emails that I have that are really a precious archive for me. Because I had learned about glyphosate, but I couldn't really speak out about it. I wasn't a professional. We didn't have the proof that we needed to be able to be vocal about it. So when Kelly revealed to us the verdict of that first trial that proved glyphosate caused non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, which is a type of cancer, 2 more cases followed, same verdict, we now could start speaking out because there was proof, court trial proof. Now tens of thousands of cases have been lined up to be heard. So it is my distinct pleasure to welcome Kelly Ryerson, also known as Glyphosate Girl. So we will hand over to Kelly.
Hi, I'm so excited to be here today to tell you what I've learned about glyphosate. I've been working on it for about 7 years, just trying to understand what this chemical is, where it's found, what the health effects are, everything I can learn about glyphosate. And this stemmed because I was dealing with really vague chronic illness that was incredibly debilitating, but non-specific. So I had issues throughout my body. I had neuropathy, I had vision problems and rashes and digestive issues. And I was really tired all the time, anxiety, depression, like the gamut of physical issues. And I saw a bunch of different doctors and like, I don't think this seems normal. And the doctors, their only answer, because my blood tests weren't showing anything, were to give me lots of medication. So I was layered on with 2 antidepressants, a benzodiazepine, steroids, gabapentin, all these different things to try and help the situation with no real diagnosis. Until finally one day, a doctor, I don't even know, probably 20th plus doctor, suggested that I try giving up gluten. And to be honest, I was thinking, try and give up gluten, because that seemed like some sort of diet trend. That was what my familiarity was. Like people in LA were talking about being gluten-free. And so I didn't really understand the impact that it could potentially make. So I tried going gluten-free anyway, desperate, and was shocked that I started feeling better. So I went gluten-free, I started eating organically, and my symptoms slowly started to resolve. And I was able to come off of all of these various medications, and it really was like a miracle. And around that time, then I started really wondering about this epidemic of gluten-free. Like, why are people finding so much relief from so many situations by eating gluten-free? And so I went to a conference at Columbia University, and scientists were talking about what it is about gluten that might be causing this inflammatory reaction in people that don't have celiac disease. And so I asked, are they spraying anything on the grain? Well, it turns out that the grain is very often sprayed with the weed killer Roundup, and it makes it into all of our food. And interestingly, across a lot of grains, a lot of beans, and I thought, what on earth? And so I decided I was going to just go in deep with glyphosate and figure out more about this. And I looked through a bunch of published research, and I was really surprised to see how little there was that was discussing any of this epidemic of chronic disease and attaching it potentially with toxins in our food supply. And around that same time, I noticed that the big Monsanto cancer trials were taking place in San Francisco, and I live just south of San Francisco. So I decided I'd go up to check out what this lawsuit was all about. And I was really surprised because I got there and there were very few people there except for the attorneys that were working on the case. And what was so stunning about that is now I would later understand this is the first time that Monsanto, like the evil Monsanto, was going on trial in front of a jury. It's the first time that it's made it that far. And so you would think that media would be all over it, but they weren't so much. So I decided I would start a blog and called it Glyphosate Girl. And I was actually anonymous at the beginning of my blogging time because I was frankly pretty nervous about the industry and what they might think of this blog, what they might do, because I'd heard rumors about how people that go up against big ag and corporations and pharmaceutical companies and everything, it doesn't always go so well for them. So anyway, I named myself Glyphosate Girl, stayed anonymous, and started blogging every day. And it was funny because there I was feeling nervous about myself being there writing about this product, and the attorneys for Monsanto actually had their own complaints, and they didn't want this trial to be televised because some of their employees and the lawyers had received threatening letters and emails, and apparently this postcard about, saying stop poisoning us, and very targeted. So they said this would be dangerous for our employees to have this because of all those incredibly violent activists. But I have to say that I guess this postcard isn't great, but in all of my years of working in food activism, I have not come across anyone particularly violent. So let's talk about glyphosate. Glyphosate was first created in 1950 by a Swiss chemist while he was researching potential chemicals for pharmaceutical use. He did not find any pharmaceutical use for glyphosate, but it was eventually patented in 1964 for use as a boiler and metal pipe cleaner because of its ability to effectively bind to and remove minerals like calcium, magnesium, manganese, copper, and zinc. Then in 1970, some Monsanto scientists realized, oh, wow, this is a really effective herbicide. And they decided to develop it and bring it to market. So in 1974, glyphosate came to market and was sold as what we now call Roundup, which is a formulated product. Today, the generic glyphosate formulations are produced by at least 100 manufacturers and can be found in 750 products worldwide, which is absolutely enormous. When it first was used, it was used in agriculture relatively sparingly. It was used at home, in home gardens and parks to try and contain weeds, but it wasn't an enormous use. However, very soon in the United States, they developed what's called the Roundup Ready GMO. And the Roundup Ready GMO is specifically genetically modified to not be impacted by the use of glyphosate. Like you could spray as much glyphosate on these crops and the crops won't die. So that is really what was at the heart of the development of the GMO, to be able to sell more pesticides and these seeds that are specifically developed to just grow, and despite being sprayed with a weed killer. That happened, and then there was an absolute enormous explosion of use of Roundup, not just in the United States, but actually around the globe. So what is in Roundup? On the label, if you look at Roundup, whether it's in the UK, Europe, or the United States, you will see that glyphosate is listed as the active ingredient. And sometimes they'll have some other things on there, but usually it's just glyphosate and water. And then inert ingredients is what the rest is called. Meanwhile, actually, those other ingredients are far from inert. It turns out there are all kinds of different formulations because glyphosate is never sprayed alone. It has to have this surfactant with it that is like a soapy substance that will help put the product inside of the leaf. So if you spray Roundup on a leaf, then it will allow for easier penetration through that leaf and actually also through the skin. We found out during the Roundup trials. So surfactants are an important part of this formulated Roundup product. And overall, the formulated product is considerably more toxic than glyphosate alone. Now, in the United States, it's horrific because they have allowed this formulation to include a POEA surfactant, which is incredibly toxic. And thank goodness a few years ago, Europe came to their senses and they said, you know, if that's too toxic for us. And they have a bunch of alternative surfactants, which are still toxic, but not quite as bad. And those formulations vary throughout Europe. A French scientist, Dr. Seralini, is very preeminent in the study of glyphosate and GMOs. And he was thinking, I would like to know exactly what is in that Roundup formulation. So he did a long study, he and some other scientists, and they discovered that not only is there the surfactant and the glyphosate, but also some really potentially harmful heavy metals, including arsenic, chromium, cobalt, lead, and nickel, which are also being sprayed. And it's just another surprising toxin that then we have to deal with in our food supply. In the UK, glyphosate use in UK farming grew 16% between 2016 and 2020. That is an alarming increase in use. The farming area treated increased by 9%. It is still sprayed in most UK towns and cities, and there is no national ban planned at all. And in fact, it's approved through at least 2025. In Europe overall, as recent news has been discussing, it's so frustrating to me because around the time of the Roundup trial, so this was 2018, there was so much news and so much interest in Europe, and people were really worried because it was clear that this is a probable human carcinogen. And there was a big movement throughout Europe to ban the use of glyphosate, and people got pretty far in doing it, and it was just near tipping a banning. And so you can imagine what the lobbyists and all the companies are thinking about this. This would be a huge loss to their markets. And so it was really surprising to me and really disheartening to all the activists that have been working so hard throughout Europe through the years that just recently, as of, I believe, last week, the EU Commission proposed that it be reapproved for another 10 years. That is stunning because it should have been on its way out, just really surprising. And so on October 12th, that's the big date, that they're going to take a vote and see whether or not it indeed becomes approved for 10 more years or not, which would just be so disappointing because that would extend its use through 2033 and cause so much more damage to the environment and all the bodies of the people that are eating things that are farmed with glyphosate. An enormous part of our exposure, both in the United States and in the UK, to glyphosate is actually through this process called pre-harvest desiccation. Glyphosate is used as a pre-harvest drying agent on several crops, including grains, sugarcane, legumes, and it leaves significant residue on our food. The farmer will spray this on these crops because it will create a really even ripening all at once and make it easier to harvest. So you don't have to wait out certain spots that may be slower to ripen than other areas. So you just dry it out and then harvest it, and then it immediately goes into our food supply with glyphosate in it. In fact, the agricultural economist, Dr. Chuck Benbrook, has estimated that over 80% of our dietary exposure to glyphosate is actually through this process of pre-harvest desiccation, which makes you think about that gluten situation for sure. Some different nonprofits did some testing, including Environmental Working Group, Moms Across America, and the Detox Project, and they looked to see what residues were in some very common foods. So there are a lot of items that have been tested in these studies, but just here to highlight a few. You can see that the things that are really high in grain, like that whole wheat bread, is over 1,000 parts per billion. Just to put this in perspective, 0.1 parts per billion, it can cause liver and kidney damage in rats. So when you're looking at something that is 1,040 parts per billion in this bread, you can see why there's a lot of concern. Same in Cheerios and these other items. Hummus is terrible because the chickpeas being sprayed pre-harvest. So that number is astounding. And you will also find it in wine and beer. Wine, because in a lot of vineyards, you'll see the farmers spray in between the rows of the grapes, and then it gets absorbed up through the roots and ultimately into the fruit, because glyphosate is a systemic herbicide. So it's not like you spray it on the outside and you can just wash it away. It actually goes up into the food, which is so disturbing. And actually, this does happen with various pesticides, and sometimes the taste of the wine can be altered according to what pesticides were being used. So some sommeliers will have such a refined palate, they can tell what has been sprayed. In the United States, they did a study to see what happened to urinary levels of glyphosate between 1993 and 2016, around the time that they started a lot of pre-harvest spraying and, of course, GMOs. And they said what we saw was that prior to the introduction of GMOs, very few people had detectable levels of glyphosate, but by 2000, 30% of the subjects found glyphosate in their urine. And as of 2016, 70% of the study cohort had detectable levels. That's very high. And I know other studies that were done in Europe also have shown significant levels of glyphosate in urine, similar to the United States. So it's in our urine. What is also incredibly stressful is all of the independent peer-reviewed research that links our dietary exposure to glyphosate to a wide range of chronic illnesses. And the UK, just like the US, has this chronic disease epidemic that I believe in large part can be traced to these toxicities in our food supply, specifically glyphosate, which is the most used herbicide of all time. So here you can see just a list of the various different conditions that have been connected through research with exposure to glyphosate. So you would think that, having seen this and knowing that there's research out there, that our regulators would say, hey, wait a second, that's not great. We should probably take a closer look at this and see, because there is a chronic disease epidemic and we are spraying a lot of glyphosate. And there is this research that shows that it can cause a wide variety of problems. But in the EPA, the US EPA said that they thoroughly assessed the risks to humans from exposure to glyphosate from all registered uses and all routes of exposure, and did not identify any risks of concern. Now, I know that to be incredibly unethical, because I went with a group from an organization called Moms Across America. We brought scientists and doctors, and everyone presented this research that showed the harm to the microbiome, harm to the liver, the kidney, cancer, a bunch of different conditions. And the EPA Office of Pesticide Program said, what you're telling us is just anecdotal. And that was just unbelievable, because there was nothing anecdotal about this research. Unfortunately, while EFSA for a while looked like they were also going to be supporting science, the real peer-reviewed independent science that shows this is harmful, but really disturbingly, this last summer, they came out and said the assessment of the impact of glyphosate on the health of humans, animals, and the environment did not identify critical areas of concern. That is a complete lie. That means that Bayer and the agricultural chemical industry got in there and was able to manipulate, buy off, threaten those regulators to make that claim. I mean, it's just nonsensical once you see how much research there is that says that's not true. In 2015, the International Agency for Research on Cancer concluded that glyphosate is a probable human carcinogen. And while that was looking at non-Hodgkin lymphoma specifically, actually glyphosate exposure has also been connected in research to breast cancer and multiple myeloma. The EPA and EFSA will base their assessments on the toxicity of glyphosate on industry-provided research. So not independently created research, but rather that which industry paid for. So obviously there's an incredible slant to the research that they're seeing that is saying, oh no, there's nothing to see here. It's totally safe. So here is a seminal study on the carcinogenicity of glyphosate. This was written by Dr. Luoping Zhang, who is a scientist from Berkeley. She actually served on a committee to the EPA that was called together to assess the carcinogenicity of glyphosate. And she said, this appears to be connected to cancer, glyphosate exposure and cancer. And the EPA didn't like it, didn't acknowledge her opinion. And so she went and she published this paper. And the study concluded that exposure to glyphosate increases the risk of some cancers by more than 40%. Just heartbreaking. It's not only cancer. Maternal exposure to glyphosate disturbs masculinization process in male pups and decreases testosterone. Glyphosate causes testicular damage and decreased sperm quality via gut microbiota dysbiosis and blood testes barrier penetration. That is so scary. That means that glyphosate is getting through the blood testes barrier and impacting men's fertility. Pregnant mice exposed to glyphosate showed ovarian alterations, hormonal imbalances, and change in sex ratio of fetuses. Urinary glyphosate levels correlated significantly with shortened pregnancy lengths and miscarriage. So sad. If you know someone who's pregnant or if you are pregnant, have them stay away from glyphosate. This is a particularly disturbing study, maternal urinary levels of glyphosate during pregnancy and its connection to the distance between the anus and the genitals in newborns. Very, very sadly, they tested the urinary levels of glyphosate in second trimester pregnant women, and then were able to deduce that higher levels of glyphosate connected to altered distance between the anus and the genitalia, which means that it is working effectively as an endocrine disruptor and disrupting the biological development of our babies. The microbiome is incredibly impacted by glyphosate. There are so many studies that are showing how glyphosate can impact the microbiome, which of course now we know is so key to our health. A healthy, diverse microbiome will dictate how so many systems in the body will work and operate. And interestingly, several years ago, Monsanto patented glyphosate for use as an antimicrobial, and research shows that actually glyphosate will act upon the good gut bacteria and can kill off some of the good lactobacillus and the bifidobacterium, but will allow some of the more pathogenic bacteria to proliferate. So when we talk about gut dysbiosis and the microbiome just being imbalanced, glyphosate can have a really large part of that happening. The different barriers that glyphosate crosses, according to research, is the blood-brain barrier. It has been connected to the development of Alzheimer's. Glyphosate can get through that very critical barrier. Also, as we discussed earlier, it crosses the blood testes barrier. And in fact, when semen was tested in 3 different men, all 3 samples came back positive for glyphosate. It also contributes to intestinal permeability by promoting the effects of zonulin on tight junctions. So if you've heard the term leaky gut or intestinal permeability, which is often associated with autoimmunity, glyphosate has a role in that. It is allowing toxins that should stay within the intestine out into the bloodstream and causing a series of inflammatory effects. Just like our body, it also does a number on the soil. So if you go back to the beginning of the talk, you will remember that glyphosate was originally used as a metal pipe cleaner because of its ability to bind to the minerals. Well, unfortunately, it also does that in our soil. So it binds to the minerals that are the micronutrients that are in the soil that ideally should be taken up into the crops, and then we eat them and we get all the really critical vitamins that are in there. But when glyphosate binds to them, they're not bioavailable, and then we are not getting them. And now you think about how vital for many of us supplements are, because we actually don't get these really critical things like zinc and magnesium in the levels that our bodies need, and just through our food, in large part because of these different farming practices. It hangs around in the soil for a very long time. In fact, Dr. Don Huber, who created this slide, he's really preeminent in the study of glyphosate. And he said, now it looks like glyphosate metabolites can potentially hang out in the soil for up to 20 years. So any of the arguments that are made that this should dissipate, or it doesn't stay there very long, or it stays a short period of time, a few weeks, like that's not true. It exists. It continues to exist. It compromises the plant disease resistance because the biome of the soil underneath it is not healthy. It's not giving this healthy structure to the crop for it to be able to prevent disease. So this is very interesting. Also in 2018, Bayer, the pharmaceutical company, purchased Monsanto. And what's really scary, if you look at that, the idea that a pharmaceutical company could own our agriculture system just seems like a real conflict of interest. Glyphosate is connected to all of these different conditions on the left-hand side: the cancer, gut dysbiosis, autoimmunity, premature birth, gluten intolerance, vitamin deficiency. Yet Bayer, as you can see on the right, has a whole series of different solutions and medications to any of these problems that are caused by the Roundup that they sell. So they have no incentive to stop selling Roundup, because more sick people, the more customers they have on the pharmaceutical end of their business. I think that more studies should go into why this should be an illegal combination of companies, pharmaceuticals and agriculture. There are a bunch of reasons why you might not know about the dangers of glyphosate, and mostly that is because there's an enormous PR machine behind the agricultural chemicals. There's so much money, and they do everything from ghostwriting the science that the regulators depend upon. It was proven in court that they do this. They will bribe key voices and organizations, large medical organizations, to support their views. They ghostwrite news articles. You can tell when they're just so excited about glyphosate in these articles. You're like, okay, who funded that? You can probably tell. They sponsor university research. It's hard to do research on and get it funded that shows the negative aspects of glyphosate application, because most universities have to come out with pro-glyphosate research if they're going to continue receiving funding from industry. There's a campaign called Let Nothing Go that was uncovered during the Monsanto trials, in which even so, when I'm online, or I am on Twitter, I'm on Instagram, or I'm on Facebook, they have people that will respond right away to my criticism of glyphosate and really push back immediately to make sure the public they want to discredit me enough that the public will not believe what I'm saying. This is true for a number of activists and scientists that just are torn down by industry when they speak up. These are some of the front groups that the agricultural chemical industry sponsors. You will see great articles about how fantastic glyphosate is and how it is necessary if we're going to feed the world. We need glyphosate in our system. That is not true. Regenerative agriculture and those practices, many farmers have proven glyphosate is not necessary to feed the world. And we won't have that many people to feed if we keep on poisoning them through glyphosate. So there's a double win. In terms of tips to avoid glyphosate, eat organically. Eat as organically as possible. You may still have some glyphosate residues in organic foods because of drift, and sometimes the manure that is used in organic fields will have glyphosate in it because animals were fed glyphosate residues on their food. So, but organic is the best thing you can do for yourself. Talk to your local farmers about their farming practices. If they're not certified biodynamic or organic, then talk to the farmer and see what they do. A lot of times they use very low levels of pesticides. Start your own organic home garden, which is what I did. I don't have that much land, but I did do a few boxes, and I'm really enjoying that so much. And it's making me feel even more connected to the soil, which is great too. Look for non-toxic alternatives to glyphosate. And there are some that are going to be hitting the market in 2024. So keep your eyes open for that. And just avoid walking your pets on the sidewalks that have been sprayed, because just like in humans, the Roundup can expose their little paws to glyphosate, which is so sad. And cancer has really gone up in pets. So, and just try to decrease your overall toxic load with water and air filters so that your body can better process the glyphosate that you're exposed to. If you want to know more about glyphosate, feel free to check me out. My website is glyphosatefacts.com, and that's the real one. I'm sure that there's some industry front groups that will do something similar that is saying how great glyphosate is. Great. Glyphosatefacts.com will tell you the real truth. And there's links to lots of the research that I talked about today. And you can find me on Instagram at Glyphosate Girl. Thanks so much for having me.
Really fabulous. You can see why I sort of hitched my wagon to Kelly Starr a long time ago and revealed some fascinating background on those hearings. So now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Stephanie Seneff. She is the author of Toxic Legacy. I highly recommend this. I will say it's not an easy read, but you'll get the gist of it. And now that we get to hear from Dr. Seneff, I think you'll be more intrigued to actually read the book so that you can share information with friends and family. Dr. Seneff is an MIT professor with accolades a mile long. She is considered by all the authorities on glyphosate to be the world's foremost authority. She's going to bring together a lot of what we talked about here today and substantiate it, I'm sure. And we will take your questions afterward. So maybe jot them down so you can remember. And Dr. Seneff, over to you.
Thank you so much for having me. And I've been really enjoying the talks that you guys have given, all the stories about how to make your own bread. I love the sourdough bread. That's all I eat is organic sourdough bread. Thank you for that. And Kelly Ryerson is amazing. And I actually met her in person at my office at MIT. We had a wonderful episode of sharing our knowledge and our concerns about glyphosate several years ago. So she's fantastic. And I've been following her Glyphosate Girl notes as we watched those trials unfold. It was so amazing to see. I remember the moment when I heard that he had won, Dwayne Lee Johnson had won. I was so shocked and delighted that it could possibly be the case that somebody could win against Monsanto. So things are changing. I think a lot more people know about glyphosate now. I'm thrilled to be here, and thank you so much for having me. And I hope people will get something out of my slides. So I guess I'll go ahead and share screen.
Fine. Is that working?
You need to. Oh dear.
So Vicky,
I have a problem. No, I think I have a problem. I have a new machine.
Oh.
I hadn't expected this. Let me see if I can do this. Privacy and security. Shoot, who was it? That's too bad. Accessibility, probably, right?
Vicky, can you make?
I think it's my problem. I hadn't expected this.
Well, we can.
Maybe you should use yours, and I can do, because I know you guys have my slides.
Right.
That's too bad. I got a new machine and I hadn't realized. I know there's a way to do this, but I'm not quite
Yeah,
sure.
you have to enable it, don't you? I'll pull the slides up for you. Just.
Yes, I'm sorry.
Bear with us.
That's all right. Determination is what gets it.
Let me just find them.
That's a shame. I'd forgotten that I have a new machine, and I know there's some tricky thing you have to do to allow, and it's not making it easy for me to figure out what that is. So
I know what they oftentimes change them too.
I know.
It's always
time. Great. Okay.
Can you see them?
Excellent. Yeah. So why don't you go to the top? First slide.
Yeah.
Let me see if I can move it up.
No, I can do that for you. Don't worry.
Yeah. Go to the first slide.
I can't.
And I will have to ask you to. Yeah. Oh, you can't put it in presentation mode?
No, I don't know why.
Oh, you should be able to.
Yeah, we
Did you try?
Before and it just wouldn't move. They wouldn't move on. So unfortunately,
that little thing at the bottom.
Yeah, no, it would move for me, but it wouldn't move on the Zoom.
Oh dear. Okay, well, we'll do it like this. I'm so sorry, everybody. Next time it'll go better. Yeah, so this is my title, Glyphosate's Negative Effects on the Ecosystem. And then we can go on to the next slide. I just want to have a quote from Professor Don Huber. He's the one who first introduced me to glyphosate, and I was blown away. He gave a talk 2012. I happened to be in the audience. And that was when I became convinced that glyphosate was the primary cause of the autism epidemic. And he said, future historians may well look back upon our time and write not about how many pounds of pesticide we did or didn't apply, but how we were willing we are to sacrifice our children and future generations for this massive genetic engineering experiment that is based on flawed science and failed promises just to benefit the bottom line of a commercial enterprise. And very heavy words, and I think he's right, and I'm very, very concerned about the future of our children. Next slide, please. Next slide.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Okay, good. So this is just an outline of my talk. First, an introduction, and then I'm going to talk about some of the toxic effects of glyphosate, go into details about harm to the ecosystem, looking a lot at the soil and the animals that are affected. And then I'm going to use Florida as an example, the Florida waterways and the agriculture around them and how that's destroying the ecosystem there. And finally, a conclusion. Next slide. So introduction, you can go ahead. Okay, great. So Roundup, and Kelly talked about this, the amount of glyphosate used every year in the United States. It's equivalent to 1 pound of glyphosate usage for every man, woman, and child. Over 330 million pounds of glyphosate used in the United States. We use more than any other country in the world, and we have health issues to show for it. And it's not just the GMO Roundup Ready crops, which are an important contribution. These crops have been engineered to resist glyphosate, so you can spray it all over the crop doesn't die. But as Kelly mentioned, it's also being used as a desiccant on a number of other crops, corn, soy, canola, sugar beets, cotton, tobacco, and alfalfa, and sugar cane as well. I should have put that in there. All of those are being sprayed right before harvest, that they're getting some of the highest levels of glyphosate contamination in the foods that are derived from those crops. Next slide. So this is the desiccant ripener just before harvest. I said wheat, oats, barley, rye, sugar cane, beans, lentils, peas, flax, sunflowers, pulses, chickpeas are all being sprayed right before harvest. So we have the GMO crops and we have the sprayed before harvest, and we have lots and lots of glyphosate in our food, which is being shown by activists like Zen Honeycutt, who have been finding shockingly high levels of glyphosate in school lunches and in processed fast foods. We can go on to the next slide. Thank you. So this is a brief history of glyphosate. It's now the #1 herbicide in use in the United States, and it's increasingly being used around the world. It was patented by Monsanto as an herbicide in 1969, introduced into the US food chain in 1974. So we've had it now for many decades in our food supply. But the amount of glyphosate has gone up dramatically since 2000 after the introduction of the GMO Roundup Ready crops. It came out from under patent in 2000, and that made it a lot cheaper. And then a lot more countries around the world started using lots of it as well. It's a mechanism of action is to inhibit an enzyme in the shikimate pathway, it was mentioned before, which is involved in the synthesis of the aromatic amino acids. These are 3 of the essential coding amino acids of the proteins: tryptophan, tyrosine, and phenylalanine. Very, very important molecules in life, in living life forms. And they're being suppressed. You can't get enough of them, both in the food and because the microbes are unable to make them in the gut because of the suppression by glyphosate. And so there's been a huge expansion of the GMO corn, soy, cotton, canola crops, led to sharp increases in the last 2 decades. Next slide. This just shows the growth of glyphosate-resistant weeds that followed after the introduction of the GMO crops. And you can look here, starting around 1999, the red line starts to go up dramatically. Glyphosate was going up, it shadows the glyphosate. And as more glyphosate is being used, you get more resistant crops. You have to increase the amount of glyphosate to kill them. And it's a vicious battle where the bugs are winning. You can see it's going up very sharply there in 2010. And now in the next slide, you'll see that the farmers are in trouble because they can no longer just use glyphosate on their crops. They're starting to introduce combination herbicides and combination GMOs, where the crop is resistant to glyphosate and something else. And then you have a combination product that you can buy to put on those crops with those multiple GMO changes to allow them to survive the exposure to these toxic chemicals. So this study was 10 states across the Midwest. It showed that almost 76.8% of the samples had glyphosate resistance from these crops, these weeds. And so this is a quote from a farmer: "GMO crops are on the edge of failure in the United States as farmers are asked to fork out more and more money on herbicides to try to control the super weeds. We can't afford it. It's near the end of the road." And many of my friends in the Midwest are on the edge of turning back to conventional farming methods. And I hope that's true, because I would love to see more farmers. And I have to put in a shout out for Mexico, because Mexico is demanding that we provide them with non-GMO, no glyphosate being used on the crops, corn that they want to buy from the United States. The United States is fighting back, but we've got farmers who are ready to start growing healthy corn to supply to people in Mexico because of this Mexican ruling. So next slide. These are just some foods, and you saw a lot from Kelly Ryan, also various foods that are highly contaminated in glyphosate. Many of these are popular with children, like goldfish crackers and Oreo cookies and Cheerios. And of course, you have the wines and the beers and the honey, which is a disaster. And all these so-called healthy foods, the hummus, you saw hummus has huge amounts of glyphosate because the chickpeas and garbanzo beans are sprayed right before harvest. This is a slide on glyphosate in honey, honey samples from around the world, mostly, of course, in North America. But the I think if you can you get, I don't know if we've got it. I've got some animation. I think you can't probably show the animation. I don't know if you click or something. It would have. Yeah, I think the animation is not working. Okay, well, maybe go to the next slide. It might be the next slide. Oh, yes, good. Okay, I did that differently. Sorry. So this is the part, out of all these samples that are shown here, the United States samples are here in red, and you can see that they're consistently higher levels of glyphosate are being found in the honey that's harvested in the United States. Okay, next slide. Toxic effects of glyphosate. This is my next topic. Is glyphosate non-toxic? Monsanto says yes, it's wonderful, perfectly healthy for humans, but kills all plants. And you have to be suspicious of something that can kill all plants, because plants and humans have a lot in common, and you can't imagine that it doesn't do anything to us if it kills all plants. And a big problem is that it disrupts our gut microbiome. Our gut bacteria have the pathway, the shikimate pathway, that glyphosate disrupts. And they use that pathway to make essential nutrients for the host, and in particular, those aromatic amino acids and the things that are derived from them, which are many neurotransmitters, thyroid hormones, serotonin, melatonin, the skin tanning agent, melanin. All of these things come out of that shikimate pathway. And when the microbes are not providing enough of those core nutrients, we get sick. And of course, the microbes also supply many other nutrients to the host that are also going to be disrupted when those microbes are hurt by the glyphosate. Things like vitamins and short chain fatty acids, acetate, butyrate. These are really important nutrients that keep your gut healthy and that are produced by the gut microbes. And as Kelly mentioned, other ingredients in Roundup greatly increase its toxic effects, and they are toxic in and of themselves. This is Seralini's work. Glyphosate is insidious. It accumulates in your tissues. Not all of it leaves, and most of it goes out quickly through the urine or through the gut. But a certain amount of the glyphosate that you are exposed to accumulates in your tissues throughout your body, including your brain, and it can have nasty effects on your health. And so also, the studies are too short. They designed the studies to say only have to look 3 months. If you don't see any problems for 3 months, you're good to go. With animal studies, that's not true, because Seralini found all kinds of bad effects of low-dose glyphosate with a rat study that began to be seen at 4 months. So after 3 months, the animals looked fine. By 4 months, they were started to have problems. By the end of their life, they had kidney problems, liver problems, reproductive issues, early death, and massive mammary tumors in the females. So 3 successful lawsuits associating glyphosate with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. This is what Kelly talked about. Really fantastic that this happened, and that it really changed, I think, the public view of glyphosate. And since then, there have been many papers coming out in recent years that are showing, explicitly showing, demonstrating glyphosate toxicity. Next slide. So the main toxic effects of glyphosate: it kills the beneficial gut bacteria, allows the pathogens to overgrow, you get dysbiosis in the gut. It interferes with the function of a critical class of enzymes in the liver called cytochrome P450 enzymes. And by the way, this is a paper that Anthony Samsel and I published in 2013. It was my first paper. I collaborated with him on this, and we covered a lot of these topics about our understanding of how glyphosate is toxic. So these cytochrome P450 enzymes, called CYP enzymes, are extremely important in the liver. They make the bile acids. They activate vitamin D, and we have a massive problem with vitamin D deficiency these days, which I have a feeling is because of the suppression of these CYP enzymes. They detoxify many toxic chemicals, and they break down prescription drugs. So it binds tightly to minerals like cobalt, manganese, and zinc, making them unavailable to the microbes and also to the host cells. Interferes with the synthesis of these aromatic amino acids, but also methionine. Methionine is the basis of the sulfur-containing amino acids, which also goes to cysteine, which goes to glutathione. So you get glutathione deficiency because the gut microbes are unable to make sufficient amounts of methionine for the host. And then it disrupts sulfate synthesis and sulfate transport, which is a big thing for me. And I've talked a lot about sulfate. If you're familiar with my work, I think a critical aspect of autism is impaired sulfate handling. Next slide. So my book on glyphosate toxic legacy, you saw it earlier, it was released by Chelsea Green in July of 2021. It presents extensive data on glyphosate toxicity. It has many hundreds of references in the back. Shows how glyphosate interferes with sulfate homeostasis. I think that's really an important part of glyphosate that's been missed by most researchers. And it argues that glyphosate is insidiously, cumulatively toxic through its diabolical insertion into proteins by mistake in place of the coding amino acid glycine. This is a very important point. It's a theory that I have. I feel like the evidence is overwhelming. I have a whole chapter showing how Monsanto's research demonstrated that this is happening. And Monsanto does not want to admit that this is the case. And this has been a battle really between me and the chemists that are saying it's not possible. And I'm saying it has to be happening because that's how you can explain all the really amazing number of diseases that glyphosate is causing. You can explain all of them through this idea of substituting for glycine. And my book goes into a great deal about that. This is the DNA code, the code for glycine. Glyphosate is a glycine molecule. It has extra material stuck onto its nitrogen atom, but that doesn't prevent it from matching the slot and being mistaken, put into the proteins instead of glycine, and then causing those proteins to not work properly. So this book was selected by Kirkus Reviews as one of the top 100 nonfiction books of 2021. Next slide. So I'm really enjoying these new papers that are coming out. This is 2019, neurotoxicology, gut microbiota, and neurologic effects of glyphosate. I think this is crucial, and a lot of people have become aware of the gut microbiome. Many papers are coming out on it. The link between microbial dysbiosis and brain problems. There's a big connectivity between the gut and the brain. The microbes communicate with the brain. They can deliver toxic metabolites to the brain if they're pathogens. You can really mess up the brain as a consequence of the gut microbiome not being healthy. And this is a review paper that shows that we state a possible link between glyphosate-induced dysbiosis and then cognitive and motor aggravations in neurodegenerative and neurodevelopmental pathologies, namely autism. And so we reviewed the negative impact of glyphosate-induced dysbiosis on depression, anxiety, autism, Alzheimer's, and Parkinson's. And all of these diseases are going up dramatically, exactly in step with the rise in glyphosate usage on core crops. Next slide. And you can see here some of the plots. And I have many plots. I worked together with Nancy Swanson for many years, and we published several papers. And these are all found in this paper. And in 2015, we published in Agricultural Sciences. Amazing, the data you can get online from the US government showing precise, very, very striking correlations between the rise in these diseases, dementia, autism, sleep disorder, and death by suicide. And there are many others, but all of these are showing that there's a strong correlation between the rise in glyphosate usage and the rise in these diseases. And people say correlation doesn't necessarily mean causation. I think in this case it is, and I believe that I understand the mechanisms by which glyphosate could be causing all of these diseases. Next slide. This is celiac disease, and Anthony and I wrote another paper, follow-on paper in 2013, specifically about glyphosate's link to celiac disease. I personally believe that all of the problems people are having with gluten today, I would imagine glyphosate is by far the biggest contributor to the gluten intolerance epidemic that we're seeing today. And so we gathered data on celiac disease is the yellow bars over time. This is 1990 over here, and this is 2010. And then the glyphosate usage on wheat, not on corn and soy, but on wheat is going up, matching much better with the celiac disease than the usage on other crops like corn and soy, which you would expect because wheat is the cause of the celiac disease. And so in this paper, we talk about non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, actually. And one of the risks of celiac disease, people who have celiac disease have a lower life expectancy. And the main reason for that is because they get non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. And of course, we've seen the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma is also connected to glyphosate usage. Next slide. inflammatory bowel disease. This is another one, and this is from another. This was from Swanson. Nancy wrote this paper before she was involved in this work before she met me, and then we collaborated afterwards. But this was a paper where she was the first author. I recommend this paper. It has like over 30 pictures, various figures showing correlations between glyphosate usage and a huge list of human diseases that are going up dramatically. And this is just inflammatory bowel disease, which of course is also a problem we're seeing today. This is Crohn's disease and inflammatory bowel disease, Crohn's disease. Again, I think it's just the disruption of the gut microbiome causing the immune cells to come in, inducing the inflammation, and then destroying the gut lining, getting the leaky gut. All of these things are associated with glyphosate. Next slide. And so this was a paper this is a new paper, 2023. I was excited to see this. And there are other papers that have come out recently that have shown cognitive issues being linked, hearing loss, cognitive issues, and severe depression being linked to glyphosate levels in the urine. This paper is looking at the NHANES data. This is the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. That's been going on for a long time. It's about 1,500 people are getting a lot of data, measuring all kinds of metabolites and things like glyphosate exposure in the urine, and then also doing extensive interviews to get their dietary information. And what they found here was that correlation between glyphosate in the urine and this marker, which is this serum neurofilament light chain, is a link to a whole bunch of nasty diseases that are associated with neurological damage. Next slide. So harm to the ecosystem. This is a remarkable paper on water fleas, and water fleas are very important because they're at the base of the ecosystem in the waterways. Lots of things feed on them: tadpoles, salamanders, newts, aquatic insects, small fish. The water fleas were exposed to concentrations of Roundup and glyphosate that were well below the approved regulatory threshold. And they found all kinds of problems: embryonic developmental failure, systemic inflammation, collagen degradation. Collagen is the most common molecule in the body. Something like 25% of our proteins are collagen molecules. It's the glue. It contains lots and lots of glycine. So it has a long sequence of GXY, 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 where every third amino acid is a glycine. Tremendous opportunity for glyphosate's mischief by getting into the protein in place of the glycine molecules. Impaired wound healing, disrupted gut microbes. So then the animals that eat the water fleas are going to pick up the glyphosate, and the animals that eat those are going to pick up the glyphosate, and it's going to propagate up the food chain. So this, I think, is very disturbing. Next slide. Here's a study on bees, and I think glyphosate is one of the primary causes of the bee colony collapse syndrome that we're all worried about, because it's going to cause crop failure for many crops that depend upon the bees to fertilize the crops and for the pollen. And Don Huber had shared with me his belief that glyphosate was possibly even the primary cause. We know the insecticides are also a problem with the bees, but this study it specifically looked at glyphosate-based formulations and their effects on the honeybees. In this study, we provided new information on the influence of commercially formulated glyphosate, again, recommended concentration, not high dose, and they looked at the behaviors of the honeybees. And so they found water responsiveness, sucrose responsiveness, learning and memory ability, and climbing ability of the honeybees were affected by these formulations at or below the recommended concentration. And of course, the honey has lots of glyphosate in it. That means the bees are being exposed to the glyphosate. Next slide. This is a study on worms, and there's a couple studies on worms that are quite interesting to me, and this is one of them. It reduced the activity and the reproduction of earthworms and led to increased soil nutrient concentration. So they exposed them to these vertically burrowing earthworms in a greenhouse experiment. And they were looking at surface casting. They were looking at the movement of the earthworms up and down the soil, which would actually, of course, aerate the soil as well and perform useful services. They found that it decreased dramatically after 3 weeks. Essentially, the earthworms got paralyzed, is what I think happened. They couldn't move. It led to a huge increase in soil concentrations of nitrate and phosphate. And these are both nutrients that when there's too many of these nutrients washing into the waterways, you get a lot of issues with cyanobacteria and blue-green algae and that sort of thing. And so there's a serious risk of nutrient leaching into the streams and lakes and groundwater aquifers. And they said that reductions in mixing of organic litter within the soil will limit long-term soil microbial activity and the soil nutrient cycling and availability, all of which may lead to reductions in the plant productivity. Next slide. And this is another one on worms. These are this species, which I won't be able to pronounce, but these very simple worms, I think they're roundworms. Parkinson's disease is caused by damage to dopaminergic neurons in the brain. That's well known. And so we know also that agricultural workers, it's been shown experimentally that glyphosate exposure is associated with Parkinson's disease in agricultural workers. And so this was a experiment with Touchdown, which is a glyphosate-containing herbicide. And it led to symptoms in these worms that resemble Parkinson's disease in the humans, with this dopaminergic and GABAergic neurons being disrupted in the brainstem nuclei of these. They are roundworms. And then they also looked at a manganese-containing fungicide that also damaged these neurons. So the earthworms the worms in the soil are being affected by these chemicals, and that's causing distress in the soil itself, because these worms are very important for recycling the organic matter and for aerating the soil. They have many, many roles in the soil that are being messed up because they're being exposed to the glyphosate. Next slide. A study on the effects of glyphosate on glyphosate-sensitive and glyphosate-resistant soybean plants. This was quite interesting because they had a very different effect depending upon whether that was GMO Roundup Ready or not. So they looked at the two different kinds of soy plants, and the glyphosate-sensitive plants, the photosynthesis was rapidly inhibited in the leaves. Photosynthesis is affected very badly by glyphosate, and that impacts climate change. Marked increase in glutathione synthesis, which is indicating an alarming antioxidant. It's upregulating the antioxidant defenses because it's suffering from oxidative damage. The amino acid balance was messed up dramatically. Glutamine, asparagine, and arginine increased, and phenylalanine, which is one of those outputs of the shikimate pathway, was sharply decreased, losing the supply of phenylalanine. Rapid, marked, and sustained inhibition of photosynthesis, assimilating carbon dioxide into the plant and ultimately into the soil in the sensitive line. The resistant plants also had problems with photosynthesis because the chlorophyll content was significantly reduced in the leaves. They couldn't make as much chlorophyll as they normally would. And the interesting thing is that the resistant plants took up very high levels of glyphosate into their leaves, much higher than the sensitive plants, the resistant plants. So when you're spraying crops that are resistant with glyphosate, it goes into the leaves. If you eat the leaves, you're going to get a very high exposure to glyphosate. And then oxidized glutathione, which is indicating, again, oxidation damage. And rubisco is a very interesting protein. It's the most common protein on the planet. Its expression was suppressed by glyphosate. And I think the next slide will show, yes, rubisco, most common enzyme on the planet, plays an essential role in photosynthesis. So we're going to have, again, disruption of the capture of carbon dioxide into the plant, into the soil, to defend against climate change, to help to get the carbon dioxide out of the air. That's going to be affected. Next slide. Glyphosate excessive use chronically disrupts the shikimate pathway and can affect photosynthesis and yield in citrus trees. Very interesting article with a lot of data. And it showed that they exposed the leaves here, but then was taken up by other leaves throughout the plant. And increased shikimate accumulation because of the suppression of the shikimate pathway, reduced the carbon dioxide assimilation, which again is this anti-climate change. And then over here, they show hidden phytotoxicity because these citrus plants were, when they were exposed to glyphosate, were unable to, their yield was lower and their growth was slowed. Next slide. So now I want to talk about the Florida agriculture and waterways. Next slide. This is just to show an example. Florida is really suffering from a lot of glyphosate exposure. This was an amazing paper from 2021. Again, there's a lot of these new papers coming out in the last few years that are quite interesting. And they looked at when you put glyphosate into the waterway, if the waterway has a lot of nutrients, a lot of biofilms, nutritional matter in the water, such as you would have in Florida, they found that the glyphosate immediately got sucked into the biofilms, and the level in the water dropped dramatically. And so it would look as if it was disappearing, but it actually wasn't. It was just hidden in the biofilms. It's an illusion. And so that's where the juvenile fish and the amphibians are living, in those biofilms, eating that glyphosate, which is concentrated there. So they said we may be under recognizing the potential ecological risk of contaminants like glyphosate that are bioconcentrating in biofilms and then subsequently being consumed. Next slide. So this has a big impact on the manatees. And I don't know if you've heard about the Florida manatees plight, but they are really suffering, especially these last couple of years. Their numbers are dropping and they're very sick. They appear to be starving. And I think they're being severely poisoned by glyphosate because they are eating the biomass from the Florida waterways that has the glyphosate concentrations in it. And glyphosate is used extensively. Of course, in Florida, you have the sugarcane fields. During the sugarcane harvest, when they're spraying the sugarcane with glyphosate, the levels went up in this study. They have increasing, but the amount of glyphosate in the Florida manatees has been going up every year since 2009. And they're sick and they're starving. And due to the loss of seagrass, but also because they're eating seagrass that's heavily laden with glyphosate, they're being poisoned. It's a very sad plight for the manatees. And I would mention also the dolphins in Florida, because I read a paper about the dolphins getting Alzheimer's disease, and they don't know why. And I suspect glyphosate may be causing that as well. Next slide. Is agriculture's use of glyphosate feeding Lake O's explosive algae bloom? So I think you may know about the fact that that Florida is coping with a lot of problems with algae blooms these days in the waterways. And this, again, the sugarcane agriculture all around Lake Okeechobee in South Florida. It's used both to control weeds and as a desiccant. And it's also used in the waterways themselves to control invasive weeds. And so there's just way too much glyphosate in the Florida waterways. These cyanobacteria actually thrive under conditions of high glyphosate because they can actually break glyphosate down, which is a service they're doing for the world by removing the glyphosate. But unfortunately, that frees up the phosphorus. And then and also the nitrogen. Glyphosate has both phosphorus and nitrogen, which are excellent nutrients to fuel the blue-green algae that then become very prolific and messes up the waterways in many ways and releasing toxic metabolites that can kill. And so it becomes really a bad scene. Next slide. Cyanobacteria feed red tide algae. So we know the red tide is from the algae that are being fueled by the cyanobacteria. And here it talks about both the coastal red tide and the inland blue-green algae have beset South Florida throughout the summer, killing vast numbers of fish and other wildlife, including dozens of dolphins, manatees, sea turtles, sharks, and eels. All of these animals are being affected by this. The cyanobacteria release the phosphorus from the glyphosate and the nitrogen, and then the red tide algae flourish. And then we have this problem of the metabolites released by the algae that are toxic. Next slide. Concerns about glyphosate in citrus. So citrus, they have a citrus drop is a problem with the Florida citrus crops. And this is something Don Huber has looked at, and he has actually worked with farmers in South Florida, and they've managed to completely get rid of citrus fruit drop by not using glyphosate on their crops. So this is an article here about this issue. And increased crop, the glyphosate exposure increases the crop's sensitivity to diseases. It reduces the availability of micronutrients through chelation of minerals. It inhibits the root growth, and it causes citrus fruit drop, which is an infection. And so as the citrus weed management programs have continued to rely more heavily on glyphosate, the occurrence of citrus fruit drop resulting from glyphosate application has become an increasing grower concern over the years. And next slide, please. So in summary, glyphosate is pervasive in our environment, and it's a significant contributor to human health issues and harm to the ecosystem. Glyphosate usage on core crops has increased dramatically over the past 2 decades in step with a dramatic increase in a number of human diseases and conditions. Multiple species of animals, including water fleas, earthworms, bees, cows, manatees, etc., are being harmed. Glyphosate disturbs the nutrients in the soil, chelating the minerals and interfering with nitrogen uptake and photosynthesis, and potentially impacting climate change. Chemical-based agriculture in Florida is leading to algae blooms, citrus greening, and harm to the Florida manatees. And thank you very much for your time.
Well, my goodness. I have a load of questions, but I want to open this up for others who might have questions. We don't see lots of good comments in the chat. So I will then ask one of my many questions and see if anybody pops in. So the shikimate pathway is just astounding, And the fact that Monsanto said, well, humans don't have a shikimate pathway, and you've clearly illustrated how vitally important the shikimate pathway is. We know that our bodies are 9 times more bacteria cells than human cells, and that those bacteria have a shikimate.
And their genome is like 100-fold more than ours. They have their collective genome is just incredibly rich. They can do so many things. I've really learned a lot and gotten tremendous respect for the gut microbes by all the reading that I've done. They're truly amazing, and we had no idea how much they were doing for us until they started not working correctly. Now, all of a sudden, everyone's interested in the gut microbiome. But, 20 years ago, there was hardly anything written about them. They were just working. They were just doing their job. And we didn't notice that there was a problem. But once they're disrupted, then all of a sudden, we're like, oh, my God, these microbes are so important. And we didn't know. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, of course, gut dysbiosis is very connected to autism. A lot of the autistic kids have issues with their gut. And I think that it's intimately connected to the glyphosate both ways, the gut and the brain and all of that.
Yes. Well, I found that working with just a few and making even small improvements is an improvement. But the fact that I was just really stunned in your book that glyphosate can mimic or hijack the glycine molecule. And we would consider, you touched on glutathione, and glutathione is glycine, cysteine, and glutamate.
Right. Yes. And both the glycine and the cysteine are problematic with the glyphosate. I think glyphosate is substituting for glycine in glutathione. It causes an upregulation of an enzyme that breaks glutathione down, which is interesting in the liver. I think because of the liver cell realizes that this is not a properly working glutathione molecule. They have to break it apart, get rid of the glyphosate, try again, make it with glycine. Hope that this time it gets glycine rather than glyphosate.
And I think you said, if I understood it correctly, that if our bodies are exposed to glyphosate, we respond with glutathione, but then glyphosate says, oh, hang on a minute, that's a little too much, and it can dial it back down. It can dial down our immune response.
Well, it actually breaks it down. So it's glutathione is very complicated with glyphosate. And I've read papers that have talked about it increasing glutathione and also decreasing glutathione, but it actually increases the production of glutathione, which then also produces glyphosate contaminated glutathione. Then it increases the enzyme that breaks it down. And ultimately, it just exhausts the glutathione. It makes it all oxidized, and it can't get it back to being reduced because there's so much oxidative damage going on. So the glutathione becomes, over time, both deficient and oxidized. And of course, autism, again, is connected with these issues. With the autistic kids, it's the same thing. Deficient glutathione, too oxidized, is what you see with autism. And glyphosate causes that.
So I know a lot of people are taking glutathione as a supplement, which is, of course, synthetic, but would boosting the nuclear erythroid factor 2 pathway that boosts our body's production of glutathione, would that sort of
yes, I mean, that would be good. And but of course that pathway is responding to oxidative damage, so in order to induce it, you have to produce oxidative damage. And maybe if you have some kind of drug, I don't know if you're thinking of some kind of drug that can induce it, but certainly NAD, nicotinamide adenine dinucleotide, is a problem with glyphosate. It comes out of tryptophan is a precursor to NAD, and tryptophan is a product of the shikimate pathway. So you have tryptophan deficiency, then you have NAD deficiency, and NAD is needed. NADPH is needed to maintain glyphosate in its reduced form, and that's disrupted by glyphosate. Even the enzyme that produces NADPH from NADP plus is suppressed by glyphosate. But NAD itself is also suppressed because it comes out of the shikimate pathway. So you've got a deficiency in NAD, which I think is huge. And people can take that as a supplement. And I would recommend that NAD as a supplement. And you've got that deficiency. And then you've got also this deficiency in the enzymes that give you the NADPH that's essential for bringing the glutathione back into its reduced form, where it's a healthy form that can actually protect you. So it's a lot of things are going wrong there with respect to glutathione in the context of glyphosate exposure.
Sounds like a vicious cycle, like so many things. But the triggering the NRF2 pathway, we've seen a boost of our body's production of glutathione by like 300%. And so that's helped quite a lot. I'm looking to see if there are any questions in the chat because I don't want to monopolize, but
there are a couple of questions. Oh, sorry. I'll just ask the questions from the chat. So Deborah says, as glyphosate chelates cobalt, does this adversely affect a person's vitamin B12
cobalamin deficiency? Absolutely. And in fact, it also disrupts the absorption of cobalamin from the gut. So I think glyphosate is causing a deficiency in cobalamin and also in folate, both of those B vitamins. And of course, the microbes are making these B vitamins for the host. Niacin is actually, again, is affected by the shikimate pathway. So some of the B vitamins depend critically on shikimate, and so, but other ones have other issues. So the cobalamin deficiency is going to prevent. Cobalamin is the vitamin that depends upon cobalt, as you might imagine, and also the corrin ring that's made by. That is part of cobalamin. That synthesis is also affected by glyphosate. So cobalamin gets hit hard. I've actually written a paper together with Greg Nye describing the issues between glyphosate and cobalamin. There's some chemistry there, biochemistry, quite interesting. But I think cobalamin deficiency is a direct consequence of glyphosate exposure. One of the things that happens is cobalamin deficiency, which then, of course, affects methylation pathways for one thing. And the methylation pathways are all messed up with glyphosate. And that's another thing that's connected to autism.
So another question.
Sorry. Another question then is collagen production in humans also affected the same way that it is in water fleas?
I think so. I absolutely think so. And in fact, we're seeing a lot of issues around collagen. You know, we have a lot of increase in people having issues with their joints and their bones and getting, knee surgery and hip replacement therapy and the back issues. I mean, we have a huge epidemic in all of these chronic pain kind of conditions that are causing us to overdose on opioid drugs. I think all of that could be traced back to glyphosate causing disruption of collagen. There's several mutations in collagen that involve glycines, individual glycine molecules in collagen getting mutated to something else and causing disease. And these diseases are even going up right now in prevalence because we're getting a simulation of a mutation by virtue of glyphosate substituting for glycine.
And I missed one question as well, which I will. How can we get rid of glyphosate from our bodies and the land? That's a big question.
Right. That's a great question. And I wish I knew the answer. It's very hard, especially when it gets incorporated into the proteins, because I think what we're having is we all have lots of glyphosate riddled throughout our bodies, bound into proteins. And then your body will break down those proteins and break them down into individual amino acids and then reassemble them into other proteins. That's happening all the time. So when you break down a protein that has glyphosate in it, you bring that glyphosate back to life. Now we can go find some other protein to get into. So it's constantly cycling throughout your body, going into different proteins and then moving on to another one and causing different kinds of problems. It's really quite a mess. You can certainly, there are things that people are trying that I think are helpful for getting it out of your gut. And I think it was mentioned actually the apple cider vinegar or sauerkraut, because they contain acetobacter, and there are species of acetobacter that can break down glyphosate enzymatically, which would be really, really awesome. So I would really love to think that you could populate your gut with microbes that can break it down. That would be ideal. And if someone actually has that, they should be almost resistant to glyphosate because these microbes are clearing it, even maybe clearing it in the mouth before it even gets to the stomach. So I think that would be awesome. I really believe in eating fermented foods, and I love sauerkraut, and we use apple cider vinegar, organic, of course, in our salad dressing. So I recommend that. Also, oxidative. So oxidation can break down glyphosate, like even just sunlight, and also oxidizing agents like hydrogen peroxide and chlorine dioxide and hydrogen peroxide are both kind of oxidizing agents that can break down glyphosate non-enzymatically. So there's a possibility there as well to break it down, because just removing it, so you can take fulvic acid and humic acid, which are complicated organic matter molecules from the soil. People are recommending those as a supplement to bind to the glyphosate and take it out through the urine, but you're not removing it from the ecosystem. You're just removing it from your body if you don't break it down.
That's a start.
Right. You'd rather get it out of your body than
We can live long enough to do something about it.
Yes,
I know Dr. Zach Bush has a humic acid.
right. Yes.
That's very good.
It was called Restore, and I think it's
Ion Biome.
Ion Biome, right? Yes.
Mm.
Yes, I have some of that.
And then I think Michael Campbell, I think he had a question.
Or
If you
two or three. Yes.
Yeah. It's been a long time since I talked to you, Stephanie. It's probably 4 or 5 years. You
Yeah.
introduced me to Dr. Bennett up at Belmont Racetrack. And then
Right.
we got involved with that group in California that was concerned about Santa Anita Raceway and all the horses they were euthanizing there.
Absolutely, yes, I know. That's so interesting with the horses. I really do think the race horses are being badly affected by the glyphosate, and they don't seem to want to acknowledge that.
Yeah, we did we put together a thing called Performance Horse Stress Management Clinics, and we spent a lot of time at Ruidoso racetrack, and then at the racetrack in Phoenix, and we learned, and then we were on the road. We did talks in front of all kinds of horse groups, and we learned a lot about horses. And you know, if anybody thinks that glyphosate doesn't affect horses and affect them really quickly, they would be wrong.
Yes,
because
I know
you know, you can when you pull them off of it, like if a horse has you know, it has some problems, and you pull him off of that glyphosate in the supplement or Roundup Ready alfalfa or whatever, that horse gets within 24 hours you see a difference.
That's
you know,
amazing.
so
I'm so glad to know that you're doing that, because I tried for a long time to try to interest them in the racehorse industry. You know, it was a group of us that we kind of accumulated there. And it was frustrating to me that they seem to be unwilling to admit it. And the racehorses are dying in alarming numbers on the racetrack, you know, and they've got the collagen problem in their hooves. They have this founder, right? And Anthony Samsel actually got a hold of the hoof of a horse that had died from founder, and he found high levels of glyphosate in the hoof, and that's because it has tons and tons of collagen in the hoof.
Yeah, and there's blood vessels in there, and nerves, a lot of nerves and blood vessels in there, and it tends to weaken them, you know, and that's why they bleed, and that's why the whole hoof. Usually, it's a hoof that goes bad when they're racing, you know, and that's why they have to euthanize them. So
it's really
anyway,
sad.
I have a couple of simple questions. Do you think there's any other molecule on the planet that has the environmental negativity effects and to the biological systems of the soil and the humans? I don't think there's another one. Do you?
I think it's the worst. I think it's absolutely the worst. Yes, it's
just because
unique,
of volume.
diabolical. Well, substituting for glycine is just extraordinary. And you know, there are other molecules that substitute for other amino acids, and they're known to cause severe disease. But there's no other molecule that I'm aware of that substitutes for glycine. So that is a unique and diabolical aspect. And glycine is so important. So many proteins have essential glycines that if you substitute something else for the glycine, it's dead in the water. I mean, even just the contractile protein, myosin in the muscles, it's got several glycines that are highly conserved. And there was a study that looked at one glycine, swap it out for alanine, you kill the muscle. It can only contract at 2%. That protein. If you get rid of glycine, replace it with alanine. Glyphosate's worse because it's a bigger change than alanine. So it would completely disrupt the ability. That's why I think we get paralysis in the gut. A lot of people are having digestive problems, constipation. Their gut is getting paralyzed by the glyphosate.
Oh yeah. Well, I can say for sure that chemicals. I sprayed an apple orchard for 2 years, about 45 years ago in the late 70s. And after I did that, I had gluten intolerance, and I have it today.
Oh, wow, I mean, that's interesting.
Pretty severe, so I know for sure it does it, you know. But back then they weren't spraying it. We didn't have glyphosate in the mix. We had Savin and 2 or 3 other ones, you know, but they were just as deadly and bad, you know.
Yes. So, well, the perception is that glyphosate's much safer than these other ones. We have all these other herbicides that are regulated, and glyphosate's really unregulated, you know. And we think it's so safe, and that's what's really scary, because its mechanism of toxicity is subtle and insidious and cumulative, and people are not willing to admit it. The regulators are not willing to admit that it's toxic.
We've worked with some autists. I'm really interested in the autism part of this whole thing, because it's definitely a huge part of autism. But do you think the autism community has accepted that glyphosate is a major part of the
Not
actual
really. I mean,
autism
some
process?
people have. I certainly have spoken at various autistic conferences around autism. I've spoken many times trying to get them interested in the idea that glyphosate is the primary cause, because I do believe it is. I think it's the number one cause. It's not the only thing that causes autism, but I think it's the most important thing. And it's going up exactly in step with the rise in autism. If you look at the previous 4 years, children in first grade in the US, and autism rates, and you plot that against the previous 4 years of glyphosate usage from the age of 2 to the age of 6 in their life, and those two curves coincide perfectly. It's like a 0.99 correlation. It's perfect correlation.
Yeah. Just one other thing. How much do you think? Well, I know it's kind of a dumb question because you've talked about it all through here, but how much do you think glyphosate plays a role in allergies?
Absolutely, yes. And of course, that's also connected to gluten intolerance, right? It's basically like an allergy. And what happens is that glyphosate disrupts the ability to break down proteins when you're eating food proteins. And then you can't break them down, because actually it's specifically proline that's affected. And the microbes produce several enzymes that help the host to break down proline. And casein and gluten both have high levels of proline. That's an unusual amino acid that requires special skills to break it down. And when those lactobacillus get killed by the glyphosate, the proline can't be split apart from the rest of the protein. And then the peptide sticks around, and those peptides become allergenic through something called molecular mimicry. And you get thyroid issues. You get, Hashimoto's thyroiditis and things like that, celiac disease and multiple sclerosis and all kinds of nasty autoimmune diseases.
If you try to teach people about glyphosate, it can become the most frustrating thing that you've ever done in your life. You'll really learn about human nature. And
I know, it's so frustrating. I think when people are told by the government that this is a wonderful chemical, it's perfectly safe for humans, it's all over the food supply, but we don't care because it's safe. And then people want to believe that. They want to believe it. And so they just don't, they won't listen to people like us. So they'll pay the price, And I'm really worried about autism. I just think it's going to be.
I think it's the worst thing of all, because it ain't going to be long till almost every boy has it.
Exactly. It's going to be like that. I think that's already close to having at least some symptoms of autism in almost every boy that's being born right now, I suspect.
Yeah. I agree.
Michael, that's great. I think we've got some other questions as well now.
Thank you. That was great talking to you.
Yeah, that's really interesting discussion there. Thank you. So another question is, how do we go about testing our soil for glyphosate and ourselves? Again, big question.
Well, I heard in the earlier discussion that it is possible to test the soil, and I have not been actively involved in that process. I do know someone who's been working with the soil. She's inherited a farm that where lots of GMO corn was grown for many years, and she's trying to turn it into an organic dairy farm. So she's been having to deal with testing the soil and trying to fix the soil. And there are people, important work is going on in rejuvenation of the soil, how to fix the soil from the glyphosate, how to get rid of the glyphosate in the soil, how to test for, the nutrient content of the soil, the mineral content, these kinds of things to try to, and then you often fix the soil in the same way that you fix the gut, by sort of taking mineral supplements and probiotics and all these kinds of things to try to restore the soil to a healthy form. I think the whole idea of supplying the soil with microbes that can break down glyphosate is probably a key component. And possibly some weed crops that can trap glyphosate might be another way to get the glyphosate out of the soil. Those are really interesting research topics, and I'm very happy that there are some people working on that. I really would love to see a time when we can think in terms of agriculture as a rejuvenating the soil through agriculture, to really think in terms of every year the soil gets better because of the way you grow the crop, and you may suffer to some extent on yield because you're putting so much in, the cost of fixing it. But once you get it fixed and then you keep it fixed, I think we're going to be in the sweet spot. But In the meantime, we're wrecking the soil, we're losing the topsoil because glyphosate gets rid of the organic matter, which makes it easier for the soil to erode. And of course, we're spilling all the nitrates and phosphates into the waterways. We're making a huge mess. And drought becomes a bigger problem because glyphosate hurts the drought resistance aspects of the crops. They become more sensitive to drought because of glyphosate exposure. So all these things are going to work against us for as long as we keep on doing what we're doing. But we really have to have a blossoming of a new way of doing agriculture. We have to get everybody on board. For individuals, buy organic food and you know, get to know your local farmer and make sure he's not using these chemicals, and then you can buy from the farmer. But I think certified organic, when we shop, we always look for the certified organic label. And I would encourage everybody to do that. I know your food costs more, but you're going to get the money back in your healthy lifestyle.
I'm going to
It's
quote
really
you on that.
interesting. It's Patricia, everyone has said that, haven't they? That and that's exactly what the People's Food and Farming Alliance stand for, you know, buy local and having access to food, or if you can't grow it yourselves. I think, did Etienne, did you have a question? Or I'm not sure. If anyone else has a question, then feel free. And there's one just come in. Okay, thanks, Etienne. Is RNAi-based products a sustainable alternative to hazardous pesticides or worse?
Yeah, that's a whole new technology, right? It's so hard to keep up with all of these different ideas that they're coming up with. I think there's a mad scientist aspect to all of this. I think that's RNA interference-based products, and that's using RNAs to influence, you know, the metabolism of the crop. I have a feeling that's not good either. I mean, I don't think any of these things are good. We really want to go back to natural, everything natural.
God's pharmacy, the way it was intended, is
exactly.
Well, you touched on many interesting points, and I can't wait to listen to the recording on this. But in the UK, our environmental secretary, Therese Coffey, said about 3 weeks ago in one of our local newspapers that glyphosate is absolutely fine, that her government will trust the science. And we know who science she's looking at. So, and that's a really difficult thing for just a concerned citizen like myself to counter and to stand up against. But
I know, it's really frustrating, isn't it? It's
I
think we've made a lot of progress. I mean, a lot of people today know the word glyphosate, whereas 10 years ago they didn't. You know, there's a lot more awareness among the public, and people are getting so sick that that's causing them to wake up as well. It's really sad that it has to get to that, but there's certainly, I think, grassroots, bottom up. You know, just the activity of individuals who can make a difference, and people can work locally. I mean, I actually had a great time. Don Huber and I both contributed to a webinar that was in a town in Connecticut. We just presented our talks about glyphosate, and there were some members of the town's you know, governing body in the audience, and they banned glyphosate for that town as a consequence of our presentations. So that was really exciting, that you could have an impact at the local level. People should talk to their school system, make sure they're not using glyphosate on the schoolyards, playgrounds, in the public playgrounds. You know, try to get activity, get attention from the town government, local politics, to work bottom up. Many towns, many cities in California have banned glyphosate. You know, so in public places, that kind of thing. Hawaii banned glyphosate use on schoolyards recently, which was wonderful. So, you know, slowly but surely, we get some legislative action. But I think for the individual to refuse to buy the GMO food is going to have a huge impact, because the farmers will then be forced to do something different if people won't buy their food.
Well, that's right. They only stock what we buy.
Right. Exactly.
Well, having this talk, this recording to share with someone, because we can't expect them to read your book, and not everybody would understand it. But having this dialogue here, that's substantial for us. People can share with their local government and say, we got
absolutely. That would really be great. This has been a really great seminar. I really enjoyed the talks that people gave, and I think it was very well done. I thank you for doing it. And we should really try to promote it and get it out there.
Well, we are very much so. And we weren't able to get Zach Bush on. He's very, very busy and I couldn't
I
get
know.
the gatekeepers, but can you imagine the dialogue just right now between the Farmer's Footprint and you? I'm going to really, hopefully we can have you on again.
Mhm.
And next
Sure.
time with Zach Bush,
That'd be wonderful.
and just not stop. We're just not going to stop.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Any more questions?
No, other than Deborah has a suggestion. How about we all send an email to Teresa Coffey with links to papers on glyphosate and ask how she can say it's fine.
Mm.
We need get her address and send it to me, and I will.
Excellent.
I have one last question, and then I'll stop talking. I hear far too many healthcare professionals tell people to wash their produce in vinegar or bicarb to wash off the glyphosate.
No,
I just wanted to hear that from you, because
it's
that's
about useless. Yeah, it's inside. It's embedded in the tissues of the crop. You can't wash it off.
right. I just need to hear it from you. Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Anybody else? Yes, corruption is a strong weed. Yes, it is, Etienne.
We've had
That's true. That's a
many,
good
many
quote.
thank yous for the wonderful presentation.
Thank you.
Stephanie. So and thank you from myself and everyone at the People's Food and Farming Alliance for the amazing presentation. It's been really, really good. So thank you ever so much.
Thank you.
And I would like to just one more word. I keep saying I'm going to shut up, but so my friend Michael Campbell told me about glyphosate years ago. I'd never heard of it. And the more I learned about it, it was plain to me that it was diabolical, but I couldn't say anything. We could talk to one friend, but we couldn't say anything. Who am I to talk against Monsanto? But then he told me about Kelly Ryerson attending those hearings, and we got that first verdict. But now we could start talking about it.
That was a huge breakthrough. That was so important. And then we had the follow-on lawsuits, and 3 in a row that won huge settlements. That was so great. Now there's like hundreds of thousands, I think, of people waiting in the wings for their day in court with the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. If we can get it to the point where it becomes obvious that it causes autism, can you imagine the lawsuits? That will take it down. Because I really believe it is the cause of the autism epidemic.
Autism
is the primary cause.
Yes. Well, oxidative stress is linked to autism, and of course, glyphosate causes oxidative stress.
Exactly. So it's very simple. Yeah. And the sulfur issue is really, there's so much evidence. I want to write another book, to explain more about autism and glyphosate, because it fits so well. I am convinced that from the chemistry, the biochemistry, the biophysics of the whole, what glyphosate does and what autism is, it all fits very, very well.
We'll look for that. We'll look for that book. But I just would like for me to summarize my bit, and then I will shut up. The difference one person can make. We're seeing the difference one person can make.
Yes.
And now we've got your book, and I've listened to miles of your talks. So what would you give advice to our listeners tonight, and people who are watching the recording? What is one thing they could do as just an individual to make a difference?
Well, I think everybody can do something, and you sort of figure out your talents. If you're very social, you can do a lot of just social talking to people about glyphosate. If you're on the internet, like in Facebook or Twitter, you can find things and post them, put little comments, just sort of put things out into the general circulation. Anything you can find about glyphosate, pass it on, just basically help to promote the knowledge, to give people the exposure to the knowledge that they need. When a paper comes out, you're aware of it, you put it up on, I do that, I just sort of post things up on Twitter, as they come across my desk. I think those are activities anybody can do. And then people who get more visibility, and of course, local government, take a look at the schoolyards, at the public spaces, the playgrounds, make sure, talk to the government people, tell them why you don't want glyphosate to be used. And, things like that can be very helpful. And of course, buying organic, telling your family to buy organic, telling your friends to buy organic, and then showing that you're healthier because of it, and then talk about that to your friends. I think all of that, everyone can do something, and any kind of skill you have. Of course, even just growing your own food would be another thing, a little organic garden in your backyard, and tell your neighbors that you're doing that and tell them why, these kinds of things.
Super. Just fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure. You guys are great.
And thank you everyone for all of the presenters have been fantastic. So much great information. Thank you to everyone who's still here, and thank you for the great questions. Just to answer one little query that just came in, yes, of course you can share it with your friends. That's what we want you to do, and that's exactly, you know, reiterating there. We would like you to share with as many people as you can, because I'm sure you've seen tonight that this information is really important, but not at all well known. So that's what we wanted to put this event on for, to get this information out to more people. And we're so thankful for the amazing experts that we've had that have helped us to give that information. And we will continue, we at the PFFA will continue to keep trying to make more people aware of the information. But of course, you guys can all contribute to that too by sharing it. Even if, as we just said, share it with one person, one more person, and then that person shares it, and then that person shares it. And before we know it, and then we stop buying the GMOs, or, you know, we check the ingredients to see, is this genetically modified? And if it is, then don't buy it, put it back on the shelf. And that again comes back down to what Patrick Holden was saying, that is, if we actually make our own food, cook our own food, and we avoid all those processed foods, then we know that and especially if we've grown it, as we try to encourage people to hear, or you've bought it from a local farmer who you've spoken to, who you know what he's using on his crops. It's just all these tiny building blocks that we build and build and build, and before you know it, we do have impact. We all have the opportunity to have impact. And so with that said, I'm going to be quiet as well now.
Thank you.
Thank you
Well
ever
said.
so much.
Thank you so much.
Thanks
for
everybody.
having me, and we'll do this again.
Thank you. Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.